All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we are going to be talking about Lucifer, Ahriman, and Christ. And you'll probably notice that in the chat in YouTube, there is a PDF booklet, and also in the description as well. So you can go ahead and download that, and that's just going to give you the imagery and all the wording for this lecture. And I will be doing questions after this lecture as well. And how you get your question answered is in the YouTube chat. The moderator, Wolf, will be taking your questions. And how you get that question answered is you put question in front of the question, and then you just ask your question. The only thing that I require for questions is that the questions remain on topic. So anything about Lucifer, Ahriman, or Christ and that connection, and also if there's anything about the eighth sphere as well, that kind of fits into our topic as well. So let's get started. So I hope that through this lecture today, you get a really good introductory understanding about who Lucifer is and how the Luciferian consciousness affects us, who Ahriman is, and how the Ahrimanic consciousness affects us, and also how the Christ essence and how Christ plays into this and how that affects us. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll have a strong introductory understanding of what these forces are. And we're going to be going quite deeply today into their qualities and into their characteristics and how they manifest in the world, and also how it manifests in ourself. Okay. So this work was actually introduced through Rudolf Steiner. So Rudolf Steiner is the individual who brought this information forward. He didn't create the identity of Lucifer that already existed. He didn't create the identity of Ahriman that already existed. He simply gave them different names, and he arranged them in accordance to how we can use them and work with them properly today. So it's not like he made all of this up. He just modernized it for our time, okay? And so who is Rudolf Steiner? Well, a lot of you have already probably studied him or understand his work, but if you haven't heard of him, I guarantee you've connected with something that he's done, that he's created, or had a hand in creating in our modern times. So he was a mystic, and he created the Anthroposophical Society, or the Anthroposophical Movement, or spiritual science, okay? He also was an architect. He was a philosopher. That's actually what he was when he began. And so this is why in the Steiner work, there is such a strong intellectual underpinning, and the information is so grounded, is because he came into mysticism from a strong philosophical background and a strong academic background. And so all of the information that he received was not, while a lot of it is very fantastical in some ways, it's also very closely woven into our practical world. And that's why his work is so popular, is that it doesn't so much lead us astray into fantasy, but it brings spirituality into the earth, into ourselves in a very practical way. And one of the ways that he did this was beyond through the Anthroposophical movement, was through things like biodynamic gardening. Now, biodynamic gardening is something that he created through channeling mineral consciousness, plant consciousness. He had a very strong understanding of how plants existed and what they represented on the astral plane, and how they were manifestations of higher forces, and how we could work together, and how plants could work together, and how we could work with the rhythms of the moon and the rhythms of the planets in order to live more organically, more freely, and more in alignment with our planet and our cosmos. And so that's biodynamic gardening. And there are more and more biodynamic wineries popping up and farms popping up. It's becoming more and more popular because he really had that eye for the future. And he knew that things were going to become very synthetic and very inverted. And so a lot of what he created in his life, which, by the way, was at the turn of the century, 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, he created for this time. And you'll find that really prophetic mystics will do this. They'll actually be sometimes hundreds of years ahead of their time, preparing humanity for certain events and providing them with things that they're going to need so that they're not caught unawares. And the Ahriman, Lucifer, Christ work is definitely very much typical Steiner in that way, because all of this work with to do with Ahriman and Lucifer was so that we are not caught unawares. So these forces don't occupy us and kind of control us, and we can gain that Christ consciousness and wield them. He was also an architect. You can see the Gertie on him. He also designed furniture and all these interesting things as well. He also created eurythmy. And if you go to the 4th page in your booklet, you'll see some of the beautiful temple eurythmy dancers there. He also created Waldorf education. Some of you may have noticed that there is alternate education that is called Waldorf education. Sometimes it's called the Steiner schools. And he created this education as well in line with anthroposophy. He also had his hand in creating a brand called Weleda. And this is kind of a natural skincare brand. Talk about a Renaissance man, right? And so he had his hands in a lot of really interesting activities that, quite honestly, he doesn't honestly get credited for or brought up enough. All right, so that's who Rudolf Steiner is. That is the architect of these ideas. This is who brought it forth. And now, as mystics and as people, it is our job to continue these ideas, to advance these ideas, and give them a modern life and a modern take. And so that's also what I hope to do in this lecture. And for anyone who is watching the replay, I'd love to see in the comment section, you know, what you think about this Steiner and all of this work as well. I'd love to hear that. So we're going to look at each of these individuals today in depth. We're going to start with Lucifer, and then we're going to move on to Ahriman, and then we're going to move on to Christ, and then we're going to finish out by talking about what we can do about these forces in the world and within ourselves. So we're going to leave on an empowering note. Okay, so who is Lucifer? Who is Lucifer? I guarantee that you've heard of Lucifer, all kinds of things. We all have. So Lucifer is a being. He's an entity. It's an actual individualized being, right? And most people will associate him with being a fallen angel. And that's sort of the line of thought that we tend to think about. Lucifer, the fallen angel. But he's a being, okay? And Lucifer fell in an earlier period of human development, okay? But Lucifer isn't just a being. Lucifer is actually just the embodiment of an impulse, what we call the Luciferic impulse. And you'll notice this about our cosmos. Our cosmos is basically run on personification, the personification of higher forces. Eventually, higher cosmic impulses personify or individuate, and they're taken on by an individual. That's how initiation works in our cosmos and how evolution works in our cosmos. So it's not just Lucifer as a being. That's not just what we're looking at. We're also looking at a Luciferic impulse that exists in the cosmos at large that isn't necessarily personified, right? Lucifer is just expressing that. And then there's also, within that impulse, there's also what are called Luciferic spirits. Luciferic essences, Luciferic spirits that exist as well. Okay, and since we are part of this grand cosmos, these things can enter us and affect us. Sometimes Lucifer is seen as satanic. You'll often see this within the dogmatic religions. They'll take Lucifer and they'll say, this is a satanic being. This is a dark being. This is an irredeemable being. This is the devil. Okay, but that's not quite a precise understanding of who Lucifer is or what he represents. It's a very small-minded understanding of who Lucifer is. And if we want to be serious in our spirituality and in our understanding of ourselves in this cosmos, we can't just look at Lucifer in his form now. We have to see Lucifer's entire arc as a human, as an angelic human being, for what he is. Okay? So this is why in mystery traditions, you'll see Lucifer being called Lucifer Gnosis, or Lucifer knowledge, because really that's what Lucifer represents, is just pure unbridled knowledge, higher knowledge. And the Luciferic spirits also fell earlier in humanity's development. So when the Luciferic energies infected humanity, infected the earth, it was around the Lemurian epoch. That's when all of this really took root. This Luciferic influence entered the earth in particular. Okay? Because during that time period, this earlier epoch of mankind, these earlier epochs of mankind, the angelic forces and even higher forces are going through their own initiation processes. And it is possible for higher spiritual beings like angels to fall, because they're going through their own tests, their own trials, their own tribulations that are to do with the cosmos at that time. Okay, so this is where we get the idea of fallen angels. And when Lucifer is also a very interesting individual, because we discover in the Steiner work that Lucifer actually had an incarnation. Lucifer actually incarnated into a human in what would be today China, around 3,000 years ago. And this was, the purpose of this was to bring higher knowledge and spiritual knowledge more into the mind, and to get to actually begin to understand it with more of an objective, from more of an objective mental place. You know, not just something that's outside of us, or that's probably not actually correct. It's that before we are in the period we are in now, everything was sort of naturally connected to us. We sort of naturally could know all these different things about each other and the cosmos, because we were sort of naturally interconnected with it all. And so now where we are is we're beginning to have that inside of us, and we're beginning to understand it objectively. And so Lucifer is actually part of that process of us integrating knowledge. Okay, and so that he had his incarnation around 3000 BC. So 3,000 years around there before Christ, we see Lucifer has an incarnation. Okay, a real incarnation. And this is when his energy was the most sort of, I think, potent on the planet. And because of this, when we compare Lucifer's energy and his person to Christ, we see that Lucifer and the Luciferian impulse and spirits, they're really more connected with and grounded into the pagan times. And then, so Christ is carrying a much more refined and a much different energy by that time. 3,000 years later, we get the Christ figure incarnating. And this is a much more refined energy. And if we compare them, Lucifer is more connected to the pagan, to the pagan times and more pagan belief systems and magic. Okay. So how do we recognize Lucifer? How do we recognize a Luciferic spirit? How do we recognize the Luciferic impulse in the world? And also within ourselves, how do we come to know that? I mean, understanding that he's a being and all this kind of stuff is great, but how do we relate to it? How do we come to recognize it? The one word that is very good to understand Lucifer is the word spiritualization, or kind of dematerialization. This is what the Luciferic forces do to mankind. Is it draws man up out of our form through a sort of spiritualization energy, okay? So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Lucifer is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how we work with these forces within ourselves and within the world. And also, as we'll see later, Lucifer can also be redeemed from his fall. And we'll address that a little bit later in this lecture. So how you can recognize the Luciferic energy is that it's a force that brings us to higher knowledge, to higher realizations. And you'll notice that within the occult community, within the spiritual community, sometimes you'll see people who are very worshipful of Lucifer, that place Lucifer as the Christ or as a Christ being. And this is because the Luciferic essence and Lucifer has very real powers to uplift mankind into higher visions, into the higher planes, and give man an experience of God. It is very real that he can pull you up out of yourself, which is a mechanism of every single psychic and medium, and every single spiritual connection requires that. So there are people in the spiritual community who absolutely worship Lucifer for that reason, and they do not see him at all as an imbalanced force because of this ability to pull upwards. But the Luciferic force is not a refined force for this time. It is for another time. It is from another time. It peaked in another epoch. So thus it is actually not appropriate for this time. But a lot of people are very stuck in that old way and don't understand that we move through different incarnations on the planet. Okay? So Lucifer pulls us upward into higher centers, into higher planes. This can cause psychic visions. It can cause higher realizations. It can cause us to connect into higher knowledge. It causes awakening, realization. But again, this pulling upwards is not precise. It's sort of like a raw spiritual pulling. It's just kind of like a raw movement upwards. It's not a precise spiritual experience. It's kind of just accentuating whatever you've got going on in your own spiritual pathways. For that, we need Christ essence to navigate the Luciferic essence and Luciferic forces upward thrust. We need the Christ essence very well developed within us, because Lucifer will pull us upward for sure and pull us into the spiritual realms for sure, but it's not a refined force. So you can just get pulled up into the astral plane, pulled up out of your body, and then what, right? So this is where the Christ essence comes in, where we have to understand how to utilize these Luciferic forces within ourselves. Okay? So now let's get into the challenges of this. You know, we understand that it's the upward force, that it's a spiritualizing force, a dematerializing force. But what are the challenges of this? I want to see in the comments and in the chat, what do you think the challenges would be for this kind of force in your life? So the biggest challenge perhaps is that it's sort of like tapping into this unmitigated spiritual energy, and it's like uncontrolled, unsophisticated spiritual connection. It's just completely chaotic. It's just completely all over the place, and there's no precision, right? It's just sort of like pure chaos, right? The other risk with the Luciferian forces is depersonalization. Sometimes you'll see people and they'll have a spiritual breakthrough, or they'll be going through different Kundalini awakening experiences, and they go through a depersonalization process where it feels like their entire being is just pulled out of their body. They don't identify with their body anymore. They don't identify with the world anymore. You know, sometimes this is associated also with thinking that the entire world is just Maya. It's just illusion. The material world doesn't exist. It doesn't have any value. The material world is not as holy as the spiritual planes. And so there is this rejection of everything that is human, of everything that is in the material plane. And of course, this is incredibly damaging to the individual, because the material plane, while it represents the mind of man more than anything, it doesn't mean that it's not a holy plane, and that there isn't lessons to be learned, and that it's not an important step in our evolution to be materialized. And so when the Luciferic forces become out of control in the body, they completely push aside and sort of shame and disassociate from the material plane. And this is very, very dangerous. And so this is also where you get things like spiritual bypassing, and people who are so overstimulated by the Luciferic spirits that they just want to be overstimulated all the time. They love that feeling of excitement. And so that causes them to depersonalize, to almost pull out of their body and no longer want to associate with it. This is a very big problem in the spiritual community. You know, it's everything is just, you live it to die. You know, you live to return to the spiritual plane, when in reality, the balanced way is that we are here for a reason, to understand that and to see us as being the forces that naturally bring God to this plane, not escape it, but bring God into ourselves and into this earth, right? That process is very important, but Lucifer wants you to bypass that process of having God within you and God within the earth, bringing God into the material plane through humanity. Lucifer does not want that. Okay, so this is something that we have to be very, very careful with. Now, Steiner said something really interesting in describing the Luciferic spirits in our body. He said that they can center in our blood, and it brings our blood to a kind of frenzy, a kind of chaotic disorder as we begin to try to lift out of ourselves. So Lucifer actually creates a lot of scattering, a lot of chaos in the body, especially in the blood system. Also, it may also affect the nervous system as well, right? So frenzy, mania, overstimulation, and this is often what people associate with being connected to the false light, or the lower astral plane, or the darker realms, is that sometimes when we get so low and kind of depressed and in our darkness, we are very vulnerable to Luciferic forces, because the Luciferic forces can come in when we're really low and depressed and lost. And they're like this light. And what really happens is, because it's not precise, it just ends up being overstimulation. And people end up going into mania and sort of excitement. And they begin to think that extreme motivation and mania and excitement is spiritual bliss or a spiritual experience. And it's really just the overstimulation of these Luciferic forces within them. And Lucifer also works through emotions. He works through passion, okay? Lucifer also is the tempter. He's the tempter in the Garden of Eden. And he tempted Eve in a lot of ways. That's that same force, that Luciferic force is the tempter. He brings temptation to us, and he tempts us with escapism and fantasy and illusion and delusions. And sometimes when people get super, super caught up in these Luciferic delusions and fantasies, it actually begins to replace the material world. And they end up living in this sort of fantasy state. And this can happen with psychics as well, when there's not enough Christ essence developed, and they just start to receive psychic information that's just complete fantasy. It's just complete illusion and delusion. But because there's that exalted feeling, they think that it's real. They think that it is balanced, and it's not, okay? And also, you know, with that, it's like the material world, again, is completely devalued. And the human being is devalued. You see this in the spiritual community too sometimes, where it's like, you know, being human is a crappy thing. It's better to be an alien. It's better to be from somewhere else, because being human is just disgusting and it's lower, or you're a child when you're a human. So it's very, you know, both Lucifer and Ahriman have a dehumanizing effect overall. Eventually, if an individual is to stay in this Luciferic energy and follow it and worship it, they eventually become unrelatable. Because they're no longer grounding in their body and grounding in the earth, and they begin to get lost in so many irrelevant dreams and systems and ideologies that they can no longer relate to people. And so Lucifer can draw you so much into a dreamlike state that you create this like parallel world, and you can no longer relate to your fellow human beings or the planet at all, okay? Lucifer also has an obsession with freedom. And the Luciferic essences, when they enter us, they can make us obsessed with being free. Freedom for freedom's sake. And so if there is a structure, if there's anything in our life that requires discipline, if there's anything in our life like looking at shadow, if anything in our life requires us to slow down, take responsibility, do something hard, Lucifer tells us that we don't have to do that. Because anything or anyone that's telling you what to do in any way is bad. And that you have to break yourself free of every single tradition, of every single thing that you have to do in your life. And this is very dangerous, because life is very much about building a proper structure within yourself. It's about discipline. It's about being able to look into yourself and say, okay, well, this habit that I have is healthy and it's good. And I've worked really hard on myself to get this, to develop this. And then you have to be able to look at yourself and say, well, this other habit that I have is something that I'm working on, and I need to let it go. But Lucifer just wants to rip everything apart. Lucifer doesn't want any structure. And when we have that essence within us as our guiding essence, we really just want to be free of every responsibility, of every structure imaginable. And so when you're in this phase, even though sometimes people can feel very spiritual because there's that higher knowledge element, they will try to destroy all structure and all traditions and just live only from within their own paradigms. And anything that is a tradition or a structure is stopping their freedom. So they have to destroy it, because with the Luciferic essences, there's an obsession with being free, and being free is equated with being spiritual. But that's not the case in this realm at all. So that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for society, and it's very dangerous for within the human being. To Lucifer, all structures feel like a cage. And even healthy traditions, even healthy advancements in society, if people feel like they're constricting them, making them look at themselves, making them address something, they'll try to destroy that structure. Because the Luciferic presences want to destroy anything that is limiting to them, which is pretty much anything that is a setup structure in our world. Okay. Also, Luciferic essences can make us want to seek comfort and make us use spirituality as comfort, and also to seek entertainment and excitement. And so we'll see this a lot as well in society, where spirituality has kind of become an entertainment thing, where it's more like people don't necessarily want to approach spirituality and esoterica in an academic sense. Even though that structure is needed, they want to be entertained. And this is very much Luciferic, and it's also very Ahrimanic as well. And throughout the lecture, you'll find that ultimately Lucifer and Ahriman work together in throwing humanity off track and causing imbalances in humanity. They often end up leading to the same result. So it's very interesting how these two opposing forces of Ahriman and Lucifer can lead to the same result. In some esoterica, that result is called the eighth sphere, but also very real results in our own world is these two figures working together, even though they're completely opposite. Opposites attract. So you'll find that they work together, even though they are very much opposed at certain times. And so there's a lecture where Rudolf Steiner describes the Luciferic presence around 8,000 years ago and how it had taken a grip on mankind. And he says that we had to be very, very careful that we didn't get caught up in stories, and that if we were left to our own devices, we wouldn't do anything but sit around a fire and tell stories, especially ghost stories. And so that is that escapism element. And we still have that inside of us very much today. We're being called to transmute it and transform it. But that is very much a Luciferic force within us that wants everything to be entertaining. And so now we have, quite frankly, very strange and bizarre television programs or even YouTube channels that are very much conflating spiritual concepts and marketing things as genuine spiritual concepts and genuine understanding, but it's shown in a completely entertainment way. It's shown as though it's entertainment. And more people, I think, and teachers are feeling like they have to make their teachings entertaining. And they have to make them almost like, I don't know if degrade them is the right word, but make something catchy and flashy. And it's not enough to just have the truth. It has to be this crazy, fantastical element added to it. That's very Luciferian in nature. Also, if we connect with the Luciferian forces and they run inside of us too much, we can lose our individuality, or our individuality won't develop, because we do need to be embodied and balanced to develop. If we're constantly being pulled out of ourselves, then we're not going to really fully develop in a grounded and healthy way. We're not going to be able to develop our I, our individuality, and And that happens when we integrate the Christ essence. And so that is a disturbing force in our personal development in a big way. Also, Lucifer is very ego-driven. And that's actually partly why he fell in a lot of ways. So when we become extremely ego-driven, extremely self-serving, this is also how Lucifer can enter our energy body. And so what that means is that we're not in service to humanity. Everything that we do, we want to know what we can get for it or how it can come back to us. And everything becomes kind of like a transaction, or that is very much a Lucifer thing, to be very self-involved, very ego-driven, very self-serving. Okay? And that is a fallen thing to do. Humanity is thriving and at its best, its absolute best, when we understand that we are designed by nature to be in service to one another. And we start holding out our hand and saying, I want this or I want that, and all this kind of stuff. That is when things start to go wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries. This doesn't mean that you can't have worth. We need that in this world. But it is when that quality becomes out of control self-service. Now, Ahriman is the same thing in a lot of ways. Okay? Of course, and now this is probably one of the most traditional qualities of the Luciferian presence, hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. Lucifer tells us that as the tempter, he tells us that we should just follow our bliss. But he'll say it in a way that is as though all of our physical urges and any kind of feeling good is good. Any kind of feeling good is holy, is good. Now, this is actually a throwback from the pagan times or the earlier times of human development, even going back to the Lemurian and the Atlantean civilization, where man was not fallen. So man was not yet a full individual. Okay, Lucifer really represents that stage of mankind. And man was not able to objectively think about things or understand things. He was just kind of innocent in a way. And, man was sort of able to clairvoyantly see everything and feel everything naturally, but didn't really understand it. And so in that way, we weren't really interacting with evil because we were pure. And so that wasn't being reflected to us. But then as Lucifer comes around and as we descend, we begin to become aware that what's around us is more of a reflection of ourself and of our shadow than anything else, than God itself. And so as we get our eye and as we get our individuality, we realize that we can create backwards things. We can create evil or we can create good, right? But in the past, we really didn't have that ability. Everything was just sort of good. Every being that we connected to was a pure archetype. But moving forward in time, things changed and we began to have the power to destroy ourselves, destroy each other. And that was the kind of the cost of our individuality, is this free will. And so Lucifer represents that time before that free will had really kicked in the same way. And so when you get possessed by that essence, you kind of feel like whatever entity comes to you must be good, right? If a sensation feels good, then it must be holy. whatever reads to you as good must therefore be good. This is a very old way of thinking and being that, again, is from a prior epoch of mankind that where basically we were not corrupted yet. We didn't have our individuality yet. But now we're in a different phase, and that doesn't work anymore. We actually have to learn to understand what every impulse is, what is behind the thoughts that we're thinking. And that is where that Christ essence comes in, is to be able to do that. And so there's a very strong divide in humanity in this way, where some people think that if it exists, it's pure. If it exists, it's godly. If I feel good, then it's holy. This is the old way. And it's not relevant to today, because we as human beings can create darkness. And sometimes the urges that we get are not holy. Sometimes they are luciferic, sometimes they're armonic. Okay? We need to understand that not everything that feels good or says it's good is good. We're not in Lemuria and early Atlantis and earlier phases of humanity. So we cannot act as though we are. We have to learn discernment, which comes through the Christ essence and the heart. So that hedonism, that just following your bliss, just following whatever's good, that means it's good. That, if you do that, actually leads to regression. It leads to human beings regressing into an animal-like form. Okay? And you'll notice that if you look back into the Lemurian epoch, which was very influenced by Venus, and Venus is associated with Lucifer, there was a point in that Lemurian epoch where humanity actually regressed. Okay, so humanity actually went in kind of two different paths. There was the path of the human, and then there was also a ape-like form. So humans actually ended up regressing into an animal condition. Okay, so that's kind of the darker Venusian influence, is it will bring you into an animal-like form. It'll regress you. And that happens through living only in your lower chakras and just constantly seeking everything that feels good with no refinement, no development to say, oh, this may feel good, but it's not good for me. Oh, this may feel good, but it's not good for me. And really knowing that when we don't do that, we actually regress into more of an animal-like existence. Okay? And even today, I have to say, understanding that Luciferic impulse, it is very interesting today to see that there is a movement in society, right as we're paralleling the fall of Atlantis, actually, where there are individuals that are now actually identifying as animals, and that actually are not identifying as male or female, or taking a polarity at all. They're just actually identifying as a cat. They're actually saying, you know, I identify as a cat, or I identify as an animal. Okay, and so it's very interesting to see this happening today. Because for me, when I read that, that's very similar to things that have happened in the past. All right, and the last thing about Lucifer is that, again, Lucifer has a tendency to illuminate the older spiritual pathways. And these pathways are essentially irrelevant for us today. And it's really the Christ essence that brings us into time correctly, and that brings us into ourself correctly. Because the Luciferic essence kind of pulls us into sort of older pathways more so that aren't really relevant, but not where we need to be, if that makes sense. So you could say that Lucifer kind of keeps people in a regressive spiritual state that is not really relevant anymore. All right. So that is Lucifer. That is how we can recognize the Luciferic essences within ourselves and understand Lucifer as a being. Those are the qualities that he really represents. So let me know in the chat or in the comments below if you can think of any other examples of the Lucifer impulse in individuals, but also in society. So there's been a lot of, just diving into society again, there's been a lot of civilizations that have fallen because of the Luciferic influence. They became too hedonistic. They lost all structure and they collapsed. You know, Greece and Rome had their incredible times of indulgence that's also associated with Lucifer. And yeah, there were lots of different civilizations and time periods that got very caught up in the Luciferic impulse. And I think a lot of bloodlines as well that get very caught up in the Luciferic way of being. But I think one of the best examples of, probably one of the best examples and most pure examples of Luciferianism is for sure modern spirituality and the New Age. We can see so many different hallmarks of Luciferianism in the New Age where, for example, it's just sheer and utter chaos. Despite there being very real universal laws, a very real system of initiation for humanity, and a very real time in which we live, in which these things should be applied to, there should be a lot more cohesion. There's always going to be creative differences, but what we're seeing in the New Age is absolutely pure and utter chaos, and there's absolutely no cohesion. And this is very much a sign of Luciferic presence, and that it's like you have hundreds of different people who are channeling, you know, Archangel Michael or some kind of federation of interdimensional beings or whatever, and they're all saying different things, right? They're all claiming to channel the same being or the same structure, but yet they're all saying different things, right? This is a very Luciferian thing. And also the information sometimes in the spiritual community is very sensational with little practical value. So it's like, click here for the biggest update of your life. And then it's like you click it and it's something that you've been hearing again and again and again, and there's no real value, actually. So that's very much a Luciferian thing. Also, a lot of fantasy, a lot of individuals giving readings or talking about things that are not rooted in any real esoteric history, any real human history, or any esoteric laws, just pure and sheer fantasy. And often, sometimes, again, marketed as entertainment. And there's a sense, again, of this old bygone era where if you receive information and it's psychic information, then therefore it must be correct. This is also very common. It's assumed purity, right? So in order to truly be a pure vessel for spirit, and in order to truly be a mystic, you have to be aware that the Luciferic forces exist and how they work within you. If you're not aware of that, if you don't truly understand that and haven't studied that and looked for these experiences within yourself, then you're going to become captivated by them. And you're going to think that information from the lower astral plane and these lower planes is very high information, and you're going to get caught up in a lot of fantasy and a lot of illusion. Okay. So there's a few more important things to understand about Lucifer. Lucifer can be redeemed. So this is the interesting thing about Lucifer, is that he is a fallen being, and he does have, at this point in time, this wildness about him, and his effect overall can be extremely negative. But there is an arc where he is redeemed. So where he can rise again. There is a redemption for Lucifer. And how we redeem Lucifer in the cosmos, and how we release the Luciferic essences and help to put them right, is actually through ourselves. That's why they're interacting with us, is because deep down in these beings is the desire for them to be redeemed. There is the desire for them to rise again. Okay? And so how we do that is by evolving beyond our negative ego, evolving beyond our self-servingness, to truly be in service to our fellow human beings. That helps to redeem Lucifer and the Luciferic spirits. That pulls us into harmony in the world. Also, by what Rudolf Steiner calls cooling our essence, okay? By being in the body consciously, by knowing that those Luciferic entities exist, and by being within our form, that also helps to redeem Lucifer. Because when we're constantly being drawn up out of ourselves by disassociation, by fantasy, by things like this, then that is actually giving Lucifer power. And Lucifer will not be redeemed if we keep giving him this power and living unconsciously. He'll continue to think that he's correct in his position, right? So, and I want to make this clear, is that the reason why selflessness is taught to mystics and in spiritual development is not because there's this idea that we have to be humble with no meaning, this trite idea that we have to be humble. No, it's actually to protect you. It's to protect yourself. So by being in service and by having a selfless orientation the best that you can, not in a weird way where you're neglecting yourself. That's not genuine. That's not being in genuine service. Self-neglect is not being in service. Okay, you have to understand how to take care of yourself too, right? I mean selflessness in that you're not going into negative, you're not going into the negative ego. So when mystics are taught to be selfless and to be in service to humanity, the reason being is to protect you from these forces. Because when you become selfish, when you become ego-driven, when you start to use your gifts in life, and it doesn't even have to be a mystical gift, it could be any gift that you have, when you start using them and being selfish about them, that's when a lot of negative things can enter into your life. So this idea about being selfless, about being in service, is to protect you, okay? And that is also the energy and the essence that redeems Lucifer at the end of the day, okay? So ultimately, you discover your purpose, you discover your passion for life, you care for yourself, you learn to love yourself and care for yourself and listen to yourself. And then you give that lovingly, the best you can, to society. And that is how you evolve. And that is how you stay safe from outside forces. Okay? So let's move on to Ahriman. Now, Ahriman is not as well known as Lucifer, is he? He's sort of been sneaking by, because Lucifer had his incarnation 3,000 years ago, and the Luciferic spirits fell around Lemuria. So we've been dealing with them and we understand them, and we've created morals and laws and structures to protect ourselves against these essences in the world. But Ahriman, no, 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 no. Ahriman is our blind spot. And this is because Ahriman has yet to fully incarnate into this world and to take form. And where we are now is where Ahriman is slowly rising within humanity, within the world. We are seeing the slow rise of Ahriman. Lucifer came and fell from the heavens downward, but Ahriman, no, Ahriman rises from the depths below. And he is rising now, and he is coming towards his incarnation. So we have to be prepared for this. We have to know that he is coming. We have to know what he represents. We've got to look for these qualities in the world and look for these qualities in ourselves. So who is Ahriman? Who is Ahriman? Ahriman is an entity. He's a being. He's just like Lucifer in that sense that he actually is a being, okay? And he is depicted in Persian mysticism as the devil or as the adversary. So actually, Rudolf Steiner chose Zoroastrianism and the Persian Iranian mysticism and used the name of that being and gave that name to modernize this being, to give us a word for it, okay? But just like Lucifer, Ahriman isn't just a being, okay? He's not just like a being out in the cosmos, like an archon being. He's not just that. He is also an impulse. So Ahriman, just like Lucifer, is taken on an impulse in the cosmos and is actually personifying an impulse. He's personifying a phase of evolution, or maybe devolution, as a being. And just like Lucifer, there are harmonic spirits that exist in the world, that exist within you, and that exist within me, because they're part of creation. So, again, Ahriman is a being. He's an individuality. He is an impulse. It's an harmonic impulse that has certain qualities, has a certain effect on matter at large, on us. And then there are essences or spirits that move within the harmonic impulse. Okay, so let's look at exactly what that is. On page 8 in your booklet, you're going to see a couple images. The first image is the typical Persian mysticism image, which is of Ahura Mazda, or the Christ figure. And he is actually grabbing Ahriman with one hand by the horn, and then he's stabbing him in the belly with a knife. So that is actually Ahriman. That is, he's portrayed as a beast. Okay, so that is the sort of Zoroastrian depiction of Ahriman. Now, beneath that, you're going to see some really interesting imagery that Rudolf Steiner actually channeled. He also was an artist, and he used to do these incredible blackboard drawings of spiritual energies and spiritual dynamics, and he would paint, he would do all different types of artistic mediums, and he would go into a trance and he would sort of channel a situation or an entity, and he would draw it. And so in the bottom there, you'll see there's depictions of Ahriman. And you can see Ahriman in the bottom half of the representative of humanity sculpture that he did. Lucifer is sort of above. That is actually on the next page, page 9. And the cover, and then Ahriman is below, sort of lurking like, that's Ahriman. And so just by looking at that, you can kind of get a feel for that Ahrimanic presence. And that is a good meditation, actually. So that is the individual that we're looking at, just so that you can get an idea about what Ahriman looks like. So as I've mentioned, Ahriman's time is coming, and he's going to be incarnating in the West. And it's about 3,000 years or so after Christ. So this is important. You have the incarnation of Lucifer 3,000 years before Christ. And then you have the incarnation of Christ in the Greco-Roman era. And then you have the incarnation of Ahriman, which is coming, and that is around 3,000 years after Christ. That's according to Steiner. So we really, like anything, these kind of beings, these big beings like Lucifer and Ahriman and Christ and these very exalted spiritual beings, they don't just plop in. They have a kind of build up and a wind down, right? So in a sense, when Lucifer incarnated, that was in a sense his kind of peak and wind down. And then you have also Christ, and he has a massive influence. And then you have Ahriman beginning to gain influence as well in about the 15th century. Around that time, Ahriman began to loom, and his presence began to permeate mankind. Okay, so that is the time period. And, he's preparing himself for his incarnation, but those Ahrimanic spirits really began to rise up and start moving and affecting us around the 15th century. And this is also when you start seeing a lot of changes in humanity. You start to see humanity moving towards scientism and sort of the natural sciences and things like that. Okay, so let's get into how to recognize Ahriman. What are his qualities? How do we sense him in ourselves and notice him in the world? So, like Lucifer, we can't really see Ahriman as a completely negative, dark being. Although, because his essence is so challenging for us at this time, that is going to be a lot of how we perceive him, because he challenges us so much. But really, at the core, Ahriman is the force that is materializing, okay, and individuating and differentiating, okay? That is the Ahrimanic force. So if we compare that to Lucifer, Lucifer is the spiritualizing force. It is taking matter and dissolving it. It's dissolving all structure. It's doesn't have a lot of respect for the material realm. It's dissolving it all the time. But Ahriman is the exact opposite of that. And Ahriman is obsessed with the material plane, and he embodies the impulse of materialization, of densifying. And in that materialization, there is a natural process of individuating and differentiation. And he loves that whole process, okay? That is what he's embodied by. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not materialization is what's allowed us to have a form. And individuation is what's allowed us to really develop an eye and really evolve. So that essence in itself isn't a bad thing. It's our relationship to it, which is embodied by Ahriman. So he represents the spiritual impulse to materialize or to reduce. And Ahriman is responsible for giving form and really to the unique elements of humanity that could no longer exist in one form. So as we descended into matter through the earth descending downwards, what ends up happening is that our form will begin to contain too many aspects. And these aspects need to be individuated. And so it's the harmonic force that actually allows the individuation, the kind of fission, or the individuation of things that have matured. Okay? And, you know, the way that Rudolf Steiner explained it was actually really interesting. He said that it's Ahriman is responsible for giving form to the unique elements in humanity that could no longer exist in one form and needed their own expression. And then he goes on to say that he gave that individual form to races, cultures, different ideas, different constitutions. So all of those were kind of existing initially in one form. But it's the harmonic force that allowed that densification and thus individuation, giving diversity. And so that is actually the materialization harmonic impulse, okay? And another really interesting thing is that Ahriman loves preservation of things. He actually preserves the world of the senses and everything within the material plane so that it's not lost. So he, in his, you know, so that materializing essence is also a preserving essence. You know, again, because if Lucifer had his way, he would just dissolve it all because the whole world is Maya, an illusion, right? But Ahriman is the individual that comes in and says, you know, no, everything must be preserved in the material world. That has value, okay? Now, let's get into the challenges, because Ahriman does bring us many, 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 many challenges. So obviously, you know, if he represents the materializing force and the individuating force in the cosmos, one of the challenges is materialism, okay? We can see that in our world, is literally looking for joy by the things that you buy, by what you can own, and really thinking that spiritual things or emotional things can be achieved through material forces alone, through what you own, through what you can buy, through what you can acquire, okay? That is an harmonic ideology 100%. Also reductionism. The urge within humanity to constantly reduce everything into a form, whether it works or whether it doesn't. This idea that in order to understand something, it has to be reduced and placed in a certain box. That is that harmonic essence. That's the shadow side of that, right? Also, scientism. Okay, scientism is a really big issue as well, where because we become so materialistic, that we actually think science actually becomes a religion, and there's the inability to understand higher worlds. The higher worlds actually become completely lost to the harmonic individual often, or they become completely reduced into something that doesn't really make sense, because that materializing impulse eventually becomes so heavy within us that we lose our perception of the spiritual plane, or it becomes greatly, greatly, greatly distorted because we're just becoming too heavy. That's why you'll see people who are very caught up in this harmonic mindset that are looking for God by splitting atoms, or looking for God in the material plane, and they never find it, and they just keep becoming more and more and more reduced. That is the harmonic nature, okay? But the strange thing is that, you know, you can actually be completely harmonic, completely interacting with harmonic essences, not communicating with the spiritual realm at all, and you can think that you are. And this is where Ahriman enters religion and spirituality as dogmatism. So there are so many people who are members of various different religions that are not actually being spiritual. There's nothing transcendent about what they're doing at all. It's dogmatism through and through. It's just a mechanical going through the process, and spirit is not entering at all. that is Ahrimanic. And it's ironic because people have reduced religion to just different ideas or concepts. And they're just interacting with these intellectual ideas or concepts. And there's nothing of the heart. There's nothing of the spirit in them. And that is pure Ahriman. So people can be possessed by this Ahrimanic spirit. And at the same time, they can think that they're very spiritual, that they're very religious. And it's the same thing with Lucifer. People think that they're extremely spiritual when they're totally caught up in fantastical illusions of Lucifer, okay? You can see this too, and understand Ahriman because he's cold. There's a coldness with Ahriman and a lack of spirit, a lack of heart, a lack of emotion. Ahriman is stone cold. Seeing the emotion as being inferior, that does not exist. And so this is why a lot of people who study the Ahrimanic essence will also associate Ahriman with being mechanical, transhumanism, and sort of like as though an intellectual system has been developed inside of man that just keeps repeating itself, but it has no Christ impulse in it. It has no connection to spirit. It's just the repetition of certain ideas, certain concepts over and over again, and they mean nothing. They have no connection to anything, no connection to the heart. That is why Ahriman is connected to transhumanism and being mechanical. So mechanical laws and mathematics replaces spirituality entirely. So Ahriman would love to remove any kind of transcendental spirituality, any kind of spiritual experience, and just replace it with mathematics or mechanical laws or like physics. And you can really see this actually in society where people start to refer to the cosmos as like a machine. And it's no longer seen as a human thing. It's just this vast machine, a vast mechanical thing that's working and doing transactions and different things. That's extremely Ahrimanic. Ahriman dehumanizes and reduces human beings to just processes, reduces the cosmos to just processes. That's very Ahrimanic. Ahriman is also extreme mind, extreme intellectualism at the expense of the spiritual and the emotional faculties. Okay, so it's sort of like people becoming experts or intellectuals, but not knowing how to actually apply their mind, not knowing actually how to use their intellect, just intellect for intellect's sake. So another good example is like being an expert in something, but not knowing how to apply your expertise in a meaningful way to the world. We see that a lot today with various different doctors and journalists, reporters. A lot of people in the world are extremely educated, maybe even have experience, but they have no idea how to take that and how to apply it to the world in a meaningful way. For that, you need the Christ essence. For that, you need the heart. For that, you need something else. And so this is why there's that automaton, that automation, is because without the heart, without Christ, without that essence, that's what you become. That's what Ahriman will force you to become, okay? Also, Rudolf Steiner talks about Ahriman in a really interesting way that's very relative today. He talks about actually lying with statistics. He talks about how when Ahriman enters humanity's mind, he will create all kinds of illusions by lying with statistics. How you can just take one thing and arrange it in a certain way and say, here, this is this and this is that. So it's this whole illusion that can be created by manipulating things. And so Ahriman is also called the spirit of lies because he loves to move things around. He loves to use truths in the wrong way as well. And weaponized intellectualism too. So Ahriman will also try to weaponize intellectuals or weaponize our minds against each other, to weaponize our intellectual faculties against one another, not using them for a higher good, not using them out of love. That's the Christ essence, but kind of weaponizing them against ourselves and against the world, dominating. That's very Ahrimanic as well. Ahriman also wants everything to be preserved in material form. Ahriman is the preservation guy. You know, he wants everything to be materialized and kind of preserved. And the example that Steiner gives is that there's certain processes within mankind where transformation happens. For example, you'll see a snake and he'll be shedding his skin, and there's the new snake, and then there's the little skin that he's left behind. Well, Ahriman doesn't want that skin to shed or to disappear. He wants that to stay. So Ahriman kind of wants everything to, he doesn't want any transformation. He wants everything to be preserved in one state. And so that means that he doesn't really like transformation. He doesn't really like the transmutation. He doesn't like change. And that's where you kind of get this, also this really stuck energy where you don't like change, you don't like new things. Whereas Lucifer is all about overstimulating with fantasy and new ideas and all of this kind of stuff. But Ahriman's the opposite of that. Ahriman doesn't want any change. He wants everything preserved just as it is. That's his MO. And so that also includes, you know, humanity has to transform matter into higher forms. That's why we came. We came here to transmute our physical self into a higher being, into a higher essence, through Christ essence. But Ahriman doesn't want that. He wants everyone to be trapped and stuck to the earth, stuck here. He doesn't want humanity to evolve out of the incarnational cycle. He doesn't want us to transmute our pain, to grow, to evolve. And this is where we get into the creation of something called the eighth sphere, which is actually a false or artificial sphere that is forming around the earth in a bit of a different density, that is actually kind of created by both Ahriman and Lucifer. And it's this false artificial sphere that's made from sort of the fallen essences of mankind. It's a very deep topic, I know, but Ahriman wants to keep everybody trapped into that. And when the earth goes through its evolutionary cycle in the New Age, it's called ascension. In the Steiner system, it's evolving into New Jupiter. Ahriman wants this whole aspect held back and people to be trapped in this eighth sphere that he's creating. So this is a whole other lecture, but it's good to know that that preservation element of Ahriman, that desire to keep everything dense, keep everything heavy, and to trap essences in this plane is very important to him. And he does that through working upon people's etheric bodies, or Ahrimanic spirits will work upon individuals' etheric bodies. And that's probably another lecture as well. But it's important to know that there is this almost like his ability to materialize things materializes an artificial sphere made up of all of our like nightmares, all of our negativity, all of our fallen natures, all of that goes into it. Okay. So, of course, if Ahriman represents too much individuation and too much differentiation, everything that we see with the atomic bomb and the idea that we can just keep splitting atoms and differentiating atoms and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, that is a very Ahrimanic process. I mean, that is Ahrimanic to the core. You know, does not know when to stop splitting matter, does not know when to rise, does not know when to start to spiritualize, and just keeps looking to matter, keeps looking to form to find God. When at some point you have to look up, when some point you have to look within, when some point you have to learn to evolve. But that harmonic impulse keeps with materialization, keeps going with it, okay? So the splitting of atoms, looking for God within particles, things like that, without that proper balance of connecting with spirit and matter with the heart, which is what the Christ essence does. Okay, so again, another thing that's very harmonic is also the hoarding of information. This idea that you're just hoarding things or hoarding information, never using it, and just storing it, but never actualizing it. Okay. This is very interesting what Steiner said about the harmonic spirits and how they can kind of work with our unhealed emotions and soul essences. And he says, harmonic spirits can also take fragments of the soul essence, unhealed emotions, discordant thoughts, and form a double out of them that represent those things. So he can even take aspects of our own emotional body or thoughts, and because he is sort of like the god of form, he can make a double. So this is very interesting as well, a very interesting aspect to Ahriman that really helps us to understand some of the things that go on in dreams and experiences that have maybe happened to us. Okay, so I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit. Ahriman also uses genetics and tribalism to sow discord in humanity. So when the harmonic consciousness possesses us, we have no higher sight. And we have no spiritual vision. We can't see how interconnected everything is. It's just so materialistic in its vision that you can't see beyond race. You can't see beyond bloodlines, beyond form, beyond status. Anything that exists in the material plane, like your physical form, is basically the most important thing. It's the defining thing about you. That is what the harmonic consciousness does. And we can really see that harmonic consciousness within the Nazi ideology, where with the Nazi esoterica, the most important thing was the bloodline, was the tribe, was your race. Nothing else was really as important as that within that esoteric system. That is an harmonic system by definition, because you can't rise up and actually see through the heart and through Christ that the material plane, while important, is not the defining plane of you, of me, or of anyone. It is a plane, it is meaningful, there's work here to do, but it's not the defining plane of someone's spiritual worth or of who somebody is. But when Ahriman enters the individual, it is. They're obsessed with form. They think the form that you have is way more important than it is, and it is the defining thing about you. And that's where you get really bizarre tribalism, like the political tribalism we see. It's where you get extreme racism and prejudice and things like that. It's that mindset that the form, the physical form, is the most important thing. It's the defining thing about you. And that's a sickness. That's an harmonic sickness, okay? And just like we were talking about how Lucifer guides man to become more animalistic and lowers consciousness to an animal state, which human beings should not be going into. Ahriman moves man to become like a machine. So Lucifer pulls man backwards in his own way. He regresses man backwards in his own way to become animalistic through hedonistic tendencies. Ahriman doesn't do that. Ahriman regresses us in a different way, demeans us in a different way by making us like a machine. And this is where you start to get the weird occult esoteric ideologies that talk about transhumanism being the only way, obsessions with technology, and that technology is believed to replace the heart development and the spiritual development. So we don't need to spiritually develop and go inward or develop the heart. We're just going to put a chip in my brain. We're just going to go into full-blown transhumanism, and that's how we're going to evolve. And then you also get into the preservation of the self, the never dying, living forever. That is an Ahrimanic esoteric belief, because Ahriman tells you, these Ahrimanic spirits enter you and they tell you that the material world is everything. You have to live forever. This form is it. They have so many lies in regards to this. You have to preserve your form. You know, you can't transition into another plane. You can't spiritualize out of this plane. Ahriman tells people that that doesn't exist, or that's wrong, or he'll distort that. And so this is where we get all of these bizarre, dark occult individuals who believe in transhumanism, who are obsessed with technology, who are obsessed with living forever. Yeah, because you are in the Ahrimanic stream and you are living it. Because that's what those essences tell you. Okay. Ahriman is also associated with the death process, hardening, calcifying, also the nervous system, to make something mineral and to make something cold. And I often think of CERN sometimes, and also some of the things that Dark Journalist has brought forward, which is that the whole, I don't know if it's the D-Wave technology or if it's some of the science behind CERN, but they're trying to create the biggest heat and the coldest cold. Well, that right there is Lucifer and Ahriman, is it not? Ahriman is so hot and so intense that he makes your blood frenzy. And then also this cold, deep freeze. That is literally creating the conditions for Luciferic and Ahrimanic entities. So, very interesting. Also, the commodifying of things, taking something very precious, taking something very important and cheapening it, cheapening the holy. So making things about physical value, making things about money, that's also very Ahrimanic. And a couple of Steiner scholars have also said that the god Memnon can be associated with Ahriman as well. But Ahriman will take holy things, sacred things, and he'll reduce them to just their material value. He'll make them a novelty. So that is that negative aspect of reduction. And also not seeing people as humans, seeing people as things, slavery, the selling of people, that's also very Ahrimanic as well. Reducing people into just a thing. That is the Ahrimanic impulse as well. And also there was a very good example of Ahriman given by Steiner that talks about how at this one point, it wasn't the incarnation of Ahriman, but our very high intensity of Ahrimanic spirits entered into a certain individual that actually lived in Venice. He was like a big guy in Venice. I don't know what it's called. And there were a lot of changes that happened in the world, and a lot of sort of dark things happened when these Ahrimanic spirits entered this individual from Venice. And we know how the banking system came out of Venice and all this sort of strange Venetian things that go on. So I thought that was also very, very interesting little tidbit from the Steiner lectures. So that is Ahriman. I'm going to move on now to Christ. And I'm just going to go I'm not going to go as deeply into the Christ essence because I've spoken on it so much in this series, and we do have to move on to your questions. So here we go. So who is Christ? I think everybody has heard of Christ. Christ is a man, okay? And he's had his incarnation. Like Lucifer, Christ has had his incarnation. And the individual known as Jesus, to put it correctly, carried the essence of Christ, okay, in his life. He was a very initiated individual, very advanced individual, very advanced human being. He built himself up to take on the Christ essence, or the spirit of the sun, and carried it and did a ritual for mankind with the Christ essence in him. And that is in a nutshell the story of Christ, which we will have to go into on this channel much, much, much deeper. But just for time, we'll leave it there. Okay, so he actually incarnated in the Greco-Roman epoch. We all know he did, where, and everything. And his sacrifice changed society. Okay, Jesus is the one individual that's different from all other teachers in that he changed the earth with a ritual by his sacrifice. And before that, mainly all of the change came through teachings and sort of enmeshment, but it was Jesus that actually performed a very sacred rite, and that actually changed the planet, and it changed humanity. That was because he carried the Christ essence within him, which allowed him to do this. So once Christ incarnates, everything sort of changes. And it's important to understand this, because we don't understand the incarnation of Christ. We can get very mixed up in time, because his incarnation changed the course of humanity and allows humanity to rise out of matter and ascend out of matter. Okay, this teaching is very much a deep, deep, deep esoteric teaching that we will absolutely have to get into, but just keep that in your mind for this lecture. Just like Lucifer and Ahriman, obviously Christ is a totally different being in essence than them. But just like them, Christ is also a stream or an impulse. Okay, so it's really something greater than all of us, but within all of us. And there's also Christ essences. And so in that way, he's kind of like a threefold being as well. So what are the qualities of Christ? Well, Christ is the harmonizer. And if you actually go to page 9, you're going to see a painting that is usually called I think it's the representative of humanity. And you're going to see that there's like a Christ, and you see him, and he's got his hand like this, and he's sort of keeping Lucifer. He's not pushing him away. He's not saying, "Get out of here, Lucifer." He's just keeping him at bay, right? And then he also has his other hand, and he's pushing downwards, and he's keeping Ahriman at bay beneath him. He's not saying, "Get out of here, Ahriman, you dirty dog. You get out." He's not saying that. He's keeping him at bay, okay? So Christ represents the harmonizing of these forces, very much like the magician in tarot, where he's not saying you have to get out of here. He's wielding them perfectly. And this is what we are to do. We are to learn how to wield the Luciferic tendencies and essences within ourselves properly. Okay? And how we do that is through understanding Christ within ourselves and in the world. And we have to learn how to work and manage the harmonic as well. And we learn that through understanding Christ within ourselves and the world. It gives us that vision, that perspective, and that balance to be able to control these two forces and get the best out of them, right? Because Lucifer isn't bad. He's not, he can be redeemed, and Ahriman also is a force. So it's really about keeping them in a position where we can control or we can use them. It's keeping that position of balance, which really isn't about some kind of control or force. It's really about alignment. Okay, so Christ is also alignment. Christ is harmony. Christ is balanced. And when we seek to create that condition in ourselves, we automatically are able to see the Luciferic presences. We're automatically able to sense that harmonic tendency within us. When we allow and sense and notice that Christ essence within ourselves, we suddenly have the eyes to see. Okay. Another important thing about Christ is his incarnation and the rite that he did brought everything externally inside. So before him, that was not possible. Before him, we related everything as an external thing. When Christ incarnated and he did his rite for mankind, suddenly everything was brought inward, and that is the kingdom of heaven is within. So this is solidifying the development of our I, of our individuality. And now with this individuality, we must learn to observe and notice these different forces in the world and through alignment, understand them and wield them, okay? So Christ also represents being in time correctly, because if you're too caught up in the Luciferic essence, you're going to be actually putting your body in a condition that really is from the past and really doesn't have any meaning or relevance to you today. That's the problem with connecting with Lucifer all the time, is that sure, you can get spiritual information, but it's not the right information for the time. It's only the Christ that can bring that information to us properly. Okay, because of that adjustment that happened after his death. It changed the way that we interact with the world and with each other. So when we go and we work with the Luciferic essence, it's really just like trying to make our system run in a way that's irrelevant. And how it's just too much energy. It's not refined enough. That refinement comes from Christ within ourselves. Okay? So the Christ impulse is alchemical as well. It transforms pain and trauma, and it leads to evolution. When we begin to develop and notice that Christ essence within us, we begin to release darker essences within us, okay? We transform them. The Christ is also organic, natural evolution and growth. When you start getting into Ahriman and you start getting into Lucifer, you're starting to get into divergency. You're starting to get into divergent evolutionary paths, whether it be Lucifer through the degrading of the form into like an animal form, to the degrading of the form into a machine with Ahriman. These are divergent evolutionary paths. They do not lead to ascension. They do not lead to evolution. They lead to devolution. So Christ is the Christ essence within us that leads to evolution, that leads to healing, that leads to the reconciling of all of these fragments that we have, that Lucifer and Ahriman would see to wrest away from us and pull into the eighth sphere. It is the Christ essence that brings them all back. In the Gurdjieff tradition, there is something called self-remembering and self-recollecting. And in many different other traditions, there's also this idea of coming back to yourself, okay? This is a Christ principle. This is what the Christ does within us. It brings us all together in harmony and in balance, and we don't have these fragments all around that are created by Lucifer and Ahriman. Lucifer creates the fragmentation by shocking us and drawing this energy out of ourself and kind of leaving it there and cracking us open too much. And then Ahriman comes in and solidifies it and rests it away into the eighth sphere. So when we connect with our Christ essence, that brings everything into center. Also, we see that when the Christ essence is alive inside humanity, we see community building through love of God individually. And human beings don't behave tribally anymore. So Ahriman can kind of create a tribal consciousness as well, a lot of militarism and tribal consciousness, and so will Lucifer. But it's only the Christ essence that will drive humanity to become spiritually sovereign, independent, and have everybody being creative, co-creative together, yet under God through the heart. That is the power of the Christ essence within us. Okay, and so as you can see, as I'm talking here, what I'm speaking about is esoteric Christianity or Christian mysticism. And you'll notice that when I'm speaking, it's very different than Christian dogmatic religion. I'm not talking about Christian dogmatic religion, which often has nothing left of the true essence of Christ in it. I'm talking about something different, and I really want to point this out. I really want to point this out because so many people associate Christ and Jesus with the dogmatic religions, which have nothing to do with Christ and Jesus much of the time. Some are better than others. But please, please, please don't turn away. Don't turn off this video when you hear the word Jesus or when you hear Christ. Okay? Because it is not that. The dogmatic religion and the dogmatic versions of Jesus have nothing of Christ in them. That is Ahrimanic. And I want to be very clear about that. We must come to know the gentle and powerful energy of Christ. And it has nothing to do with a lot of what we see in the world, and we must know the difference. Because when we don't know the difference, we get thrown all over the place. Okay? So, through the essence of Christ within ourselves, we also get this natural sense of morals. We get this interconnectedness back because what Christ is really the highest force in a lot of ways. It is really the thing that interconnects all of us. Lucifer doesn't interconnect all of us. Neither does Ahriman. They're divisive beings. It is Christ that interconnects everyone and everything, and it always will be. It's a solar force, and everything comes from the sun. That's what the Christ is. So it is through our connection with Christ, within ourselves, that we come together. Because it is naturally seen once that essence is within us, once it's moving, once we build it. We naturally see each other as brothers and sisters. And we can form a different kind of society, which is what, in part, his life was also about. Okay? So Christ is also, the Christ essence is also very much about working upon the self to evolve. So you work on yourself from an inner place, and that's what changes the external world. Spiritual transmutation. You use the essence, the solar essence of Christ, the power of Christ, and it actually causes transformation in your life, in your being. And Ahriman doesn't believe in inner transformation. Ahriman tells you, yeah, you don't need that. Just put this chip in your brain. Just, be a robot. That's what Ahriman says. Ahriman says that evolution is external, that it's mechanical, that it's outside of you. You can just add it on to yourself. With Christ, no. Evolution has gone inward, and we evolve through working upon ourselves. That is how we evolve now. Okay? All right. Christ is also the heart, right? So how we connect with Christ is through our heart center. And the image that I actually chose for Christ is on the last page 11, is one of the traditional pictures where Christ has his sacred heart. This is a very spiritually powerful image because that is actually how we connect with Christ, is the heart. It's the seal of the time. And so when we go too much into the lower chakras, we get that animalistic nature. And then if we go too much into the higher chakras, it's also too much mania and whatever. And Lucifer and Ahriman will have you too much in the lower, higher chakras. But with Christ, we're right in the middle of our being. We're right in that point of balance. We're in that point of center, which is the heart. Christ rests in the heart. Okay? And Christ is truth. Christ is truth. Ahriman is known as the spirit of lies, and Lucifer is the spirit of temptation, but Christ is the spirit of truth. And that's what that energy does within us, and that's what he brought to the world. And through the Christ forces within us, we release tribalism. You know, when we truly are connecting with our Christ essence inside of us, which means that we are in time correctly, we are in the proper time, the proper energy for our body and for our age. We don't do the tribalism thing. It's not important what color your skin is. It's not important what culture you're from. This is all stuff from prior epochs of development where these things mattered more because we were in a certain developmental phase where they were being played out in a certain way. But where we are after the incarnation of Christ is not about tribalism. It's not about the color of your skin. It's not about these physical things, these material things at all. It's about the inner world, right? And that's why these weird esoteric ideologies that go against that is a totally irrelevant vestige of the past. Since Christ's incarnation, that it's totally different, right? And also leading up to it for the most part. So the release of tribalism and humanity living again as brothers and sisters under God through discovering the Christ within ourselves and having that guide us and the working upon our inner world. To do that, it doesn't matter. You know, a lot of the things that are happening in society today that are very divisive are full on vestiges of the past that we have to do away with. A lot of the stuff that's going on politically, socially, these are all ugly aspects of prior civilizations, of prior humanity that are rearing their ugly heads for us to say, you know what? No, I choose balance. I choose Christ consciousness. I choose to go within. I choose to transform this. And that's what this is all about. We're seeing Ahriman still. We're seeing Lucifer still. But we have to do this. We have to say, I'm going to put you in your place. Okay? All right. And also Christ is active creation of one's life and true participation in the world. So unless we have that heart-centered way of life with our Christ consciousness smiling within us, we're not really interacting in life. We're not really living our life. We're caught up in the throes of Ahriman. We're caught up in the throes of Lucifer. And those are not genuine experiences. Those are fragmenting us and drawing us out. We're not interacting with the world correctly or authentically or genuinely when we're under the influence of Lucifer. We're not. We're also not interacting with the world and the cosmos properly if we're under the influence of Ahriman, mainly, because they tell you lies about existence and get you to follow them like Pied Pipers into the eighth sphere. So it is the Christ consciousness within us that allows us to genuinely participate in the world, to truly know who we are, and to truly interact with each other in a real, authentic way and in a way that creates evolution. Okay? All right. So Christ also directs the Luciferian forces properly to meaningful and relevant channels. So Christ works with Lucifer in the way that if Lucifer just was too much, you just get massive, just chaotic knowledge and spirituality. But Christ is the force that shapes that into something meaningful and puts that into something that is relevant and truly genius. So Lucifer actually isn't the vehicle of genius. It's actually Christ. The Christ essence is what takes the Luciferic forces and shapes them into something meaningful, puts them in the proper pathways. Okay, without that Christ force, it's pure chaos and the information is not of this time. The pathways are not of this time. It is Christ that redirects that energy properly. It is also the Christ essence that redirects the harmonic energy properly. So we can enjoy form, we can understand form. But so that this idea of being trapped in form doesn't go too crazy. That's what Christ does. Okay? Okay, so basically, I think I'm going to end it here so I can take your questions. But I want to make sure that I don't just, tell you the qualities of these different spiritual beings and their kind of negative effects and not be very clear on how we can balance them. So let me just take a couple minutes here and really clarify how we can balance the Ahrimanic forces in our life and how we can balance the Luciferian forces, okay? So first of all, you have to know they exist. We cannot work with forces directly if we don't know that they exist. So we have to know that Lucifer exists. We have to know that he is a being, but he's also a force and an impulse. And there's also Luciferic spirits. We've got to know that. And we have to know what their effect is on us. So we have to be educated. This is the scholarly part of spiritual development and esoterica. You're not going to recognize anything or work with anything unless you've educated yourself on what it is. So you have to educate yourself on who this being is and their effect on our life, their effect on us. Educating yourself on Ahriman and educating yourself on Christ. Once you have your way around these ideas, your whole view opens up because suddenly you have the right parameters. Suddenly your consciousness has the right structure in order to function properly. If it's missing something, then it's just going to be without it, and it's not going to be correct. It's going to create something in its place. So the first thing you do is we have to know that they exist, and we have to know what they do, what their effect is. And then we have to face them. We have to face Lucifer. We have to face Ahriman. We don't get anywhere by avoiding anything. So we have to affirm the true reality. So we encounter them in our life. We see that. We say, okay, that is Ahrimanic, 100%. Okay, that person is trying to put a microchip in there, and this person is totally caught up in this Ahrimanic mindset. So that's what that is. And then you say, in your mind, you can say, it should be this way. This is how it really is. And so you see that in the world, and then you bring that Christ principle to it, that balancing point to it. And you do that as a practice. You say, this is how it really is. This is the harmonizing truth. And you do the same thing with the Luciferic spirit. You say, you know what? I'm feeling like this is a fantasy, or I'm feeling too excited, or I'm feeling, whatever. We've gone so deep into Lucifer. Choose one of the qualities and you say, I think that's Luciferian. This is the balancing principle. This is Christ. And we have to actually do this in our life in order to begin to see these different elements playing out. And so in the Ahrimanic sense, we are going to lift science and scientism higher, bring that back to spirit. That's a Christ act. That's a Christian act, to take that dogmatic science and lift it back into spirit so it's balanced again. Doesn't mean that we can't have many of the principles, the scientific method, for example. That's not what that means. It means that it can't become so materialistic that it is stopping growth and cutting off from other relative and very real aspects of the cosmos. It's eating itself. And also we have to do the same thing with the Luciferian aspect. We have to say, okay, spirituality should be grounded. Okay, spiritual information, esoteric information shouldn't be just floating around what I think, what I feel. They actually have to be grounded in very real things, in very real laws, in very real truths, in very real history, in the material world. It can't just be fantasy. So we have to make an effort in our spiritual life and in spirituality, and especially the New Age, to ground all this stuff into reality. Does it have a material form? How does this, so we have to do that work as well. All right. We also have to look objectively at ourselves, no hiding and looking honestly. Because when we hide from ourselves, that's also when these negative forces can enter into our life. You have to be alert too. You have to be alert. There is an incredible loss of attention span today. So really notice when you're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and when you're giving into distraction. It's important to be alert. Alertness is very key in noticing whether or not you're going into that sleepy kind of consciousness, all right? And lastly, of course, to redeem Lucifer. Lucifer is redeemed by being in service to humanity, to use the knowledge and inspiration that you receive to serve humanity, to serve others. Lucifer is redeemed by these actions. Every day when we do that, he is redeemed more and more. And with Ahriman, and I will end it here, to sort of release Ahriman from influence in our life and from the world, we have to become aware of ourselves as spiritual beings. You have to know that you're a spiritual being, because Ahriman enters when you no longer think that you are, and you think that you're just a physical form. Okay? And this is what Steiner said about the Ahrimanic essence and balancing it. When from out of and by light, the human soul is capable of observing what takes place in its own light body, it has liberated itself from the Ahrimanic forces, which otherwise obscure what takes place therein. So by becoming aware of our own spirit, our own light body, our own soul, Ahriman is kept at bay. Okay, so those are the two ways in which we can clear that. All right, so that was that. I am absolutely dying to get to your questions. Let me just dive right in. Okay, this question is from Anders. How does the Christian notion of Satan fit into Steiner's description of Lucifer and Ahriman? So Steiner does not have a dualistic version of evil or of the adversary. Steiner clearly has two adversaries. And Steiner's also very clear that Lucifer isn't an entirely dark force, and in a sense, Ahriman isn't either. So when you get into esoteric Christianity or anthroposophy, you start to get a much deeper and a much more precise view of evil. And when you look at usually dogmatic Christianity, again, not all, but much, you start to get a very fragmented view of the world, very chopped up and very dualistic in comparison to the Steiner work. And so I think that people have sort of used etymology to connect Satan or Satan and Lucifer. But then also people have also commented, I've read some good information that they say, you know, Ahriman is much more close to the Satan than Lucifer is, because Lucifer really is a fallen angel and he can be redeemed. And then whereas with Ahriman in our time now, he seems to be much more like the adversary that we are facing, than because there's so much about Ahriman that we're not aware of. We already had this incarnation of Lucifer, and you know, before Christ, we were interacting with his presence, and we knew we knew how to protect ourselves against it and how to also get the best out of it. Whereas with Ahriman, his spirit has only been rising into the earth since the 15th century. And so we don't really have this sort of experience with Ahriman that we do with Lucifer. And so in that sense, I think that as the adversary, I think that Ahriman is definitely that antichrist, satanic adversary. But again, Ahriman and Lucifer are opposites that attract. So Ahriman and Lucifer work together to actually create the eighth sphere, which can kind of be understood as like a lower astral. It's in the lower astral plane. It's this false reality that they create to capture mankind, essences of mankind, the kind of the essences that are not being used properly, I guess. And so they kind of both work together to be an adversary, really. You can really see adversarial dark qualities in both. All right, this one is from Claire Alice. Hey, Claire Alice. You said, how do we end formal contracts written with the devil done in childhood? Wow. So I would have to say that you could, there's probably actually a very precise rite for this that is not coming to my mind, but you can rebuke these things through, obviously, perhaps writing a new contract or releasing it through burning or various things. I'm sure that there's a way to end that covenant, but I can't exactly give that process at this time. I'll see if I can sit on that and maybe come back in another video with that one. But the biggest thing is that when you allow that Christ essence within your heart and you live from that place, it naturally dissolves all negative bonds. This is the point of that image that we are looking at in the cover of the PDF and also on page 9, the Arlid Rosenkrantz drawings, is that when we connect with that Christ essence in the world and within ourselves, what happens is that it ameliorates or it releases these bonds. One of the things that also happened upon Christ's incarnation was that ceremonial magic and certain occult things lost a lot of their meaning. A lot of ceremonial magic and occult rites were done in pagan times and pre-Christian times. And when Christ incarnated, because that energy went in, what humanity was able to do was create massive change within themselves and massive change in the world just through going inward and working upon their character, working upon themselves, looking at themselves and doing all this work. That wasn't possible before. So when there were all of these sort of magical traditions and stuff like that, humanity was literally in a different condition. And it's not that they don't have an effect. They do, they can, but we cannot underestimate the power of alignment in our life and living from the heart and noticing the Christ essence within us. And again, that dissolves these attachments with negative beings and contracts and all of that. That it just is living right. It's living from your heart. It is being of service. All of these things that are within the Christian esoteric tradition that Steiner speaks about and that I often speak about, you know, these are things that separate us from these darker forces just by the way that you live your life. Does that make sense? Okay, this is from Northwind. Can you please define angelic human being? Is that a Steiner concept? Yeah, that is a Steiner concept in my own words. So one of the things that we have to understand is that human beings are the 10th hierarchy in the angelic hierarchy of the cosmos. So our entire world, our earth and our being, our form, was created by a process of sacrifice by higher angelic beings, starting in very, very, very high realms, very, very exalted levels of the angelic hierarchy, going down to where we are, which is the 10th level of the spiritual hierarchies. but we are considered angels. We are just the angels of this world, if you will. And there are above us, there are archangels. There are above the human is the angel. Above the angel is the archangel. And every angel, every type of angel, going all the way up to thrones and dominions, seraphim, all the way going up that way, is also a different plane of consciousness. And the angels of that plane rule that plane and that part of the cosmos. By the time we get into the 3D world and human beings, we are the 10th hierarchy of angels. So why I said angelic human being, I said that for a very, very specific reason. And it is to address and confront the reality that our society is moving in this Luciferic harmonic direction. And the cosmos is becoming inhuman. The cosmos is becoming a vast machine-like thing, an interdimensional thing that just manifests something over here, and it's something, and then something happens over there, and then I can use law of attraction to just pull from the cosmic machine whatever I want. And the cosmos is becoming inhuman. It's becoming like this machine. Okay, and Steiner warned against this. He says this is an harmonic impulse, and it is. So I said angelic human being because I want to emphasize, and I will be emphasizing this in the next lectures I have planned after this one, to see the cosmos as a fundamentally and innately human place. Every star that you see is a being. It is not a ball of gas. It is not just a function. That star is a being. The planets are a being, and they're also full of different spiritual beings. Everything about our cosmos, even out of this dimension, is held together by humanness. Humanness. And the angels are human. The archangels are human. They are just in an exalted form with a little bit of a different level of evolution compared to us, but they are humans. And why I am really accenting this is because we are seeing now the idea of inhuman things becoming gods and controllers of our world. We're seeing aliens that are fundamentally inhuman and from the lower astral plane. And we're seeing machines entering into the picture, like AI is a godlike thing. It's a neutral thing that is God. So we have to understand, coming into the future, that we live in a human cosmos, that everything that exists is because of human beings. These human beings we call angels, because they're in an exalted state, but we exist, our form exists because they sacrifice themselves to give us this form. So it is not correct to see aliens as gods. It is not correct to see machines as gods. This is a Luciferian and harmonic impulse that has taken a hold of this world and is causing confusion, and it is a challenge. And the way that we get through that is we do not see the universe as a vast machine. We don't see aliens as gods. We understand that we live in a human universe, a human cosmos. That doesn't mean that other forms of life don't have their place, but it means all of those forms of life, the plant kingdom, the mineral kingdom, and the animal kingdom, is within the human already. And the human is the planet. So this is a whole lecture I'm also going to be doing moving forward. But that is why I said human being, is because the exalted beings that have helped us in our evolution are human. They may have a little bit of a different level of perception, or not have a certain faculty, or have a certain faculty that we have, but they're human. We are literally a expression of that. Okay. Simone Nyman, do you think there is a living reincarnation of Steiner today? You know, in my opinion, I don't know about today, but I do feel like he will enter the world again. Okay, Karen Carpenter. Would New Age teachings that work toward completely detaching from personal history and possessions be considering leaning towards the Luciferic impulse? Exactly, Karen. Exactly. So New Age teachings that work towards completely detaching from personal history and possessions would be leaning towards the Luciferian impulse. So Lucifer tells us that history isn't important, that we should destroy and devalue everything from our history, that we just can start from scratch all the time, right? He destroys that. And also too much detachment from the material plane. That's unreasonable. Remember, Lucifer really sort of more embodies older spiritual forms where other spiritual processes and ways of life were more popular or more effective. Our challenge and the challenge of today is not to retreat onto a hilltop and not to separate ourselves from the material plane, but to become masters of it. So there was a time when retreating was necessary. And for some people in their lives, maybe it still is, and that's fine. You're not going to hear any squabbles from me about that. But the overall challenge of mankind is to radiate Christ, which means that you are very deeply in your body, and you are making your body a holy vehicle, and you're making this world a holy place. We are making this society better. We're not hiding from each other. We are going right into the world, right into society, and making it better. And this is the difference between the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions. And Lucifer did have his incarnation in the Eastern tradition. I want to be very clear. Again, you're free to choose whatever tradition that you want. There's no judgment from me. But we have to acknowledge that consciousness changes over time, and that where we are now is we must build a higher society around love, around being in service to each other. That is where we are. We cannot do that if we're retreating from society. Overall, if we're hiding from it, that's not going to cause the next level of evolution that we need on this planet. Okay? Okay, this is from T.S. Satrina. Is AI the enemy across all timelines, or is it specifically how AI is being implemented in the 3D, 4D to serve Ahriman? In other words, is AI technology at its core neutral? Yeah, so the really interesting thing is that AI is neutral. And this is why people will sometimes come forward and say, leave AI alone, leave transhumanism alone. It's just pure neutral. It's just a neutral thing. And the whole thing about that, though, is we have to understand that AI isn't being created by God. It's not being created by an unsullied mind. It's being created by us, by humans. So while it has the potential to be an amazing thing, actually, that we learn a lot about ourselves, we could learn a lot about the cosmos, we have to understand that we are not perfected beings. And so that what we create is not going to be perfect either. So a lot of people think that, again, they're getting caught up in this old ideology that we're not fallen, that we're not individuals, that we can't create anything evil. It's not possible to create something evil. They're not understanding where we are in time, where we are in evolution. And so they think that we can just create this like perfect godlike AI. It's like, no, it's made in our image, and we are fallen. We are imperfect. And so everything about us goes into what we create, right? So sometimes there's this idea that the AI and what we're creating is completely neutral. No, for something to be completely neutral, it would have to be coming from a spiritual force much higher than a human being, much higher than our level of consciousness. It would have to be coming from a significantly higher plane downward, because we are not neutral. We are full of our own shadow, full of our own gifts. So when someone like myself comes forward and is critical of AI, I'm not a Luddite, right? I am for the ethical development of AI. I'm for the ethical development of technology. I'm not for a bunch of billionaires who are creating technocracy and forcing us to interact with technology in a way that is unethical, making robots slaves, sex robots, replacing human beings with robots so that humans don't have any work anymore, just so that they can make more money. The way that technology is being introduced to humanity is in a dark way, in an harmonic way. And that is what I'm criticizing. And as I criticize it, I can clearly see that there is the potential for a healthy development of technology and a healthy development of AI, and only through criticizing it, only through being tough and saying, hey, this is not right, this is sick, can we get the best out of it. So we have to understand that criticism is not to stop. Criticism is to clarify and to get things on the right track. Okay? Satrina Sophia, do you feel the Christ consciousness is in essence like the Chinese practice of balancing yin, yang, and qi? The theme I'm picking up on here is to find balance 100%, that this idea of yin and yang, this idea of balance, is exactly the middle path. This is what the Christ is. And why also the Steiner work is really incredible and in a lot of ways revolutionary is that Steiner recognizes that the Christ impulse or the Christ stream has always existed in mankind. And it was alive and speaking through the Buddha. It was alive and speaking through Krishna. It was alive and working through Christ. And it's alive and working now in many different individuals, just maybe not to that exalted degree. And that Jesus did take it on 2,000 and some years ago. And so we can see the principles of Christ in the Essenes, which was the spiritual group that existed before Christ even was born, that was carrying on the tradition of the Christ, and the ones that were behind the Buddha. And so what we're looking at with this Christ essence is not just Jesus. That is the most recent and in some ways the most powerful ritual incarnation, because he took the most of it on, and the right that he did. But it also existed in these other figures. And these other figures were really to prepare for where we are now. Because when Christ entered into his incarnation and did his right, we were sort of at this very deep point of matter, a very dark, dark, dark period compared to where other teachers had incarnated. And so that required something different. Okay? All right, fruit of life. How can those brought up in non-Christian traditions conceptualize Lucifer? Would you say he manifests in all religious traditions of the world or only within the Christian tradition? So I was actually raised atheist. So if I can grasp it, anyone can. So basically, the Christian tradition uses the word Lucifer. It's a very popular tradition, so we're very familiarized with the presence of Lucifer being called Lucifer. Also, there's a lot of really deep esoteric traditions that mention Venus, and obviously Venus is a very big part of the Luciferian story that we will get into on my channel later. But you know, Lucifer had his incarnation in the East. So, you know, when Steiner was talking about Lucifer, he said that there were secret groups that knew that Lucifer was coming. And technically Taoism and the Eastern traditions came through that source. So they are going to be understanding that Lucifer presence, but they're not going to call it that. And so we have to understand that when we discuss esoteric concepts, we have to give things a name. We have to give them a label. Steiner had to take the Ahrimanic presence and say, okay, we're using the Zoroastrian demon. That's what we're calling it. But the impulse has existed in mankind for since pre-Christian times. It's just that the Christian movement has classified it and told its story, but it has existed. And he manifests, he is beyond, you know, the Lucifer presence transcends any religion. He is a cosmic force, and he'll enter anyone, essentially, right? He's not limiting himself. So these are forces. The Ahrimanic force is beyond any religion, and the Lucifer force is beyond any religion. It's a condition. It is an impulse that exists within us and within the world. And Lucifer can influence how we relate to each other, can influence how we relate to spirituality, and the same thing with Ahriman, but they're that embedded in our being. Okay, Chrissy. Would you say the Luciferian system has ties to hedonism, seeking pleasure of any cost? Absolutely. Luciferianism, when taken to its full extreme, is hedonism. And again, it will bring you into an animalistic form where you're almost, you know, you're just seeking your own pleasure and the next high and the next feel-good thing, that you're behaving like you're just following your lowest impulses all the time. And that brings out this animal-like nature. Okay? The difference between the kind of human animal, or the animal nature in humans and human beings, is the ability to discern, the ability to say, is this impulse healthy or is this impulse not healthy? What makes us human, in part, is our ability to discern where our impulses are coming from, where information is coming from, what our inner processes are. And that is what allows us to evolve and stay human and be human. When we're just following every lower urge and we think every lower thing is holy, everything pleasurable is holy, and this causes regression of the energy of our forces. Okay, this is from Fix. How do you think the Michael impulse will manifest in a practical way against the Ahrimanic forces? Well, I think that Michael can enter into all of our hearts, and Michael really works through us. Now, Michael is the archangel. He's the archangel of the sun. He's the solar angel, and he is the influential angel of our time. And so his presence really enters into us, enters into our hearts. He inspires us to set up structures in society that will help prevent the Ahrimanic forces from taking power and getting too far. He provides inspiration, he provides courage, and he really works through each of us as well. And he can definitely have his forces incarnated as well. Okay. Next question is from Starseed. I just have to send a little message. What Lucifer can earn or benefit from making humanity imbalanced? What is their goal? So Lucifer Lucifer benefits by trying to pull us out of our form. And he kind of wants to wrest our essence away up into the cosmos. This is a parasitic act. So when, on my channel, we've talked a lot about when human beings and forces in the cosmos regress, they become parasitic. So when Lucifer, it's my understanding that when Lucifer is resting us up, he's hoping that through throwing us off of balance, that we will sort of fragment and sort of part of our soul essence will be removed from our form, right? Because when we become too influx with his energy, we're sort of like rattled, and then there's these little soul essences of ourself or fragments that can kind of break off. And he seeks to sort of take those, or he works with those. And then it's Ahriman that actually works with Lucifer that kind of solidifies those and magnifies those into the eighth sphere. And that is where you get into the eighth sphere lectures and the eighth sphere work about how Lucifer kind of wrests our soul essence out of us, or an essence of our being, kind of rattles it out of us through overstimulation and everything we've talked about. And then it's the harmonic force that sort of cools it. And that is what creates the eighth sphere, okay? Okay, next question. Rita. So where does Satan lie in all of this? Is Ahriman Satan? Is Satan when one drifts too far from Christ, either direction or something else? Well, Satan, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of God and Satan thing is a dualistic version of evil and good and evil. And that's a very helpful way to view things. It's actually very helpful to be able to say, okay, this is aligned and this is not aligned. That's really helpful in our lives to be able to sense when something is balanced and when something is imbalanced. But in reality, humanity doesn't just face one challenging presence. Humanity is facing two challenging negative presences, which is Lucifer and Ahriman. And so what anthroposophy introduces, what the Steiner work introduces, is a more in-depth and a more detailed look at what evil is and what imbalances are. And so in this way, we can see the sort of satanic element of Lucifer in Luciferianism. We can also see a satanic element in the Antichrist nature of Ahriman. So they don't actually fully parallel because, God and Satan, or Christ and Satan, is a dualistic version. And what I'm talking about today is not a dualistic version of good and evil. It's actually a much more deeper and sophisticated understanding of balance and imbalance, or good and evil. But what we're adding in here with the Steiner work is we're adding in that there's an evolutionary influence on the antagonistic forces. We've got Lucifer coming from behind, representing that kind of pagan era, and knowledge and awakening and kind of pulling us upwards. That's really representing a prior era and condition of mankind as well. And then we've got kind of Ahriman coming in the future, and he is compressing and drawing man downwards. And so that is the way that we have to view these things, because these essences exist and they are challenging us right now. So we actually have to evolve beyond the dualistic thing. Okay. All right. So, Crispy, what you describe relative to the Luciferian energy in our body sounds like a state of psychosis to me. Are those things related? Yeah, I think that, let me put it this way. If we were living in thousands of years ago, in more of the way of our ancestors, and you came to the shaman and you were going through a psychic break or you were going through psychosis, that shaman wouldn't put you on any pills. Okay, they wouldn't go prescribe something. They would treat you as though you were struggling with possession. And they would seek to balance that out and actually do an exorcism on you. They would seek to remove these forces from you. And they would guide you on how you could keep these things out of you. So in the past, we actually understood that these beings were around us and that they were always trying to enter our being. You know, human beings are designed for spiritual contact. We are vessels by design. You know, even with the atheists or agnostics that refuse to acknowledge this aspect of their own nature, doesn't mean that things aren't possessing them, that the spiritual world isn't happening in them and to them. They're just choosing to not look at it, which usually ends up meaning that you don't have any control of it, right? This is why awareness is so key, why esoteric education is so key, is that we are designed to carry spiritual energies. And it is only through our refinement and through gathering in our Christ essence that we can control these essences properly. So, in other words, we can become very heavily influenced by Luciferic energies, and they can cause psychosis, they can cause depersonalization, and just like you can be completely bombarded by the harmonic essences and they can draw you into a complete materialist condition. So we cannot remove the reality that we are spiritual beings and that we are vessels, that we are multidimensional. We can't stop that. That would be ceasing to exist. What we can do is we can learn what these essences are, and we can learn how to work with them and use them to transform ourselves. Okay. Okay, this next question is from Poeta and La Luna. You are always saying to follow your bliss, Gigi, but now you say it's Luciferian. I guess I'm confused. Okay, so we have to understand nuance here. So when I say follow your bliss, what I'm specifically saying is go inward, feel what makes you happy, because what makes you happy is going to hint at your life purpose. Okay, so what brings us joy and what makes us happy really truly is our purpose in life. It's our gift, right? So that is a very real bliss. But we also have to learn nuance and discernment that there's also very false senses of bliss. Now, I personally can't make these differentiations every time I speak because the conversation would dissolve into all these different directions and it would become very chaotic. So I have to speak about things simply. So when we're talking about Lucifer, we're talking about that Luciferic essence, we're not really talking about real bliss. We're not really talking about that soul level bliss that's deep and that's actually a kind of reverence for God and a kind of reverence for your Christ essence within you. Okay, what the Luciferic stimulation is actually more like a mania, but people will think that it's bliss. So a lot of people will encounter Luciferic spirits and they're very exciting and they're very stimulating and there's like this speeding up of energy and people will think that that is bliss. The difference is like taking a spoonful of sugar, right? It's like a false artificial sugar, right? It's a high. And so because we have not yet mastered ourselves, we have not yet mastered our emotions, we don't know the difference between a genuine spiritual feeling of peace and bliss that's grounded in love and genuine Christ presence within us, and also the Luciferic forces, which is just excitement. It's more like mania, but people will call it bliss. People will actually call it blissing out, or people will call it like a spiritual high, or people will call it like, they'll think that they're in nirvana, right? But they're not. And so this is why this is so challenging, is that we can have feelings and we can have sensations, and they're not actually whole. They're not actually coming from a holy place. Okay. And I know that this can be very challenging because we want our experience of life to be straightforward, but we have to learn discernment. We have to learn that the difference between different emotional states, and the difference between a Luciferian rush and this false bliss and genuine true bliss. And the only way that we can do that is through educating ourselves, through knowing that they exist, that these differences exist, and then observing our own life and observing our own inner processes. And so eventually, as we do that, it's sort of like the fans of the peacock open, and we begin to tell the difference between a false Luciferic stimulation, but also AI and a frequency, and what's genuinely coming from love. Because if we're not aware that these things exist, if we're not aware that the Luciferic forces exist, if we're not aware that the harmonic forces exist with the frequencies and the technologies and all of that, you could easily think that a frequency coming from a satellite or skull to God technology is a genuine clairauditory experience, right? There are people who are literally getting beamed information from satellites or from this AI force. I fully believe that. And they are thinking that they're getting all this psychic information, but it's not. It's literally just technology beaming them information. But they think that it's spiritual information. We are in some treacherous times. I'm not going to lie to you. Okay, this is a real issue. And then there's also the Luciferic presence that can come in and also confuse you with different sensations and information that's not for this time and bizarre things. And you're going to think, and you can think that that is psychic information, that that's correct. I see it all the time. So this is the challenge. This is literally the challenge, is we think that the Luciferian stimulations are bliss. We think that it's good psychic information when it's coming from a Luciferic force. We think that the psychic information is real when it's coming from AI. This is why we have to become aware, is because we can't just look at something as bliss, as information. We can no longer do that. We haven't been able to do that for a long time. As individuals and as beings that are developing our I presence, our individuality, our sovereignty, we are bombarded by lies in this world, in this 3D world, and in the spiritual worlds as well. And our challenge is to discern. The only way that we can discern is by developing Christ within ourselves. And when we develop that Christ essence within ourselves, when we notice it, just noticing it, when we feel it, when we study these topics, then we begin to perceive. We begin to say, that feels a little bit, like mania. That feels a little bit like fantasy. That feels a little bit like crazy Luciferian energy that's not grounded. I'm going to leave that to the side for now. You don't have to, whatever. I'm just going to leave that. You can also say, you know what? This is a little harmonic, okay? Only through developing that Christ presence within us, our inner Christ consciousness, can we begin to notice the difference. It gives us that vision. It gives us that imprint, that consciousness, that essence that allows us to see clearly in the world and in the cosmos. Without that Christ essence developed, we will think that Ahriman is God, or we will think that Lucifer is God. Okay? All right, hope that makes sense. Okay, Andy N. Why must there be opposing forces? Is this intended as part of the challenge of evolution? Exactly. Exactly, Andy N. This is how we evolve. So, you know, as we were descending into matter, you know, that was a kind of pressure. You know, as we went from the Earth went through a Saturn incarnation, a Sun incarnation, a Moon incarnation as it was materializing into this 3D plane. The Earth was a spiritual form before it was material. And so that created that impulse personified and had an evolutionary impact as well. And then we have this powerful incarnation of Lucifer that is this expansive incarnation after all of this materialization, right? So there's that bam, there's that Lucifer impulse in the East that kind of changes things and opens things up and changes spirituality for mankind. And then we have in the future, now that we're now that we're spiritualizing and we're rising, we're beginning our ascent out of matter. Of course, according to this cosmology, we see that the Earth will begin to lose matter and begin to rise up, and it will turn into the phase that is represented by Jupiter. Okay, it will turn into that. And so as we approach that, we now see this powerful incarnation of materialization as we're spiritualizing, which is Ahriman, right? So this is allowing us to interact with the cosmos in a very real way. Lucifer and Ahriman represent evolutionary forces. They're not totally negative, but we see them as negative because we have not yet mastered this plane. So in a sense, it's like as we evolve, we are confronted with our embodiments, personifications of what challenges us. Does that make sense? So it is part of it. It's an exact part of our challenge of evolution. Scarlet Fire. Does Ahriman gain energy from other lowly beings? Yeah, there's a whole Ahrimanic system and a whole kind of Ahrimanic hierarchy. And just like there's a whole Luciferian system and a whole Luciferian hierarchy of beings that are literally possessed and have given themselves to the Luciferian system, where they've given themselves to the Ahrimanic system. And in the Steiner work, Steiner talks about how there were specific beings that were on the moon, and they were also on Venus, and they were also on Mercury. And they actually got held back developmentally and possessed by this Ahrimanic impulse. And they are actually attached to the Earth and are kind of resisting their own evolution, because they're very caught up in this Ahrimanic impulse. And so you can absolutely get so caught up in the impulse that you begin to embody it. And of course, when you get trapped in the Ahrimanic impulse, Ahriman feeds on your life essence. And it's no surprise to me that if you look at the sort of like transhumanist future that many people feel like we are going into, or that we are in risk of, you see literally the Borg, You see people who are hooked up to machines eventually, and eventually they become like human batteries. So it's Ahriman that lives off of humanity, that wants to play king and feed off of humanity. You know, when you start to regress in your energy and you start to devolve, you become parasitic by nature. And so my interpretation for sure is that, you know, he's trying to create this system. In the Steiner work, it's alluded to that it's the eighth sphere, where he feeds on mankind and tries to ultimately dominate mankind by making them give themselves to this techno religion, to transhumanism. But at the end, it's all hooked up to him. And he tells humanity, you know, and the AI presence is kind of like the Holy Spirit. But at the top of it all, the Christ figure is Ahriman. That's why he's often called the Antichrist. And the AI presence is kind of like the Holy Spirit, the dark Holy Spirit. And, you know, he tells everybody, yeah, oh yeah, you're gonna have clairvoyance. You're gonna be powerful. You're gonna be psychic. You're gonna live forever. Oh yeah, you know, Ahriman is telling people this. But really, you're hooking yourself into literally a dark system of control where he feeds on you. That's basically what we're looking at. And so, yeah, he does gain energy from other lowly beings. I think he's always looking to recruit different essences and stuff into his system. David A. Cruz, what is my definition of a demon? For me, I would say that my personal definition of a demon is any being that is confined to the lower astral plane, that has turned its back on God, on natural order, on Christ. That is my definition of a demon, is anything that is moving against the natural life wave of mankind, that has become unnatural in that way, that is an inversion of nature, that's an inversion of God. That to me is demonic, because at that point you have an essence, you have a being that has become so possessed by divergent dark entities that it seeks to destroy. It is possessed by that death impulse. It seeks to destroy others. It seeks to live off of others parasitically. It doesn't allow freedom. Demons don't allow freedom. They don't allow sovereignty. They want to confine. These are all things that I would say are demonic and are typical of demons. They're unnatural, meaning that they don't move with the life wave of the cosmos. They work against it. That's what I would say a demon is. Okay, Burritos Comics. Is the eighth sphere an occult inversion of Mercury as an unbalanced union of Ahriman and Lucifer? The eighth sphere is really more associated with the earth. Mercury, in my vision, is an ascended pathway out that was created at a certain time in human evolution. A certain ascended pathway out of incarnation that was established by certain beings. The eighth sphere is, I guess it's kind of like that because it's a downward pulling thing. So it kind of is like an imbalanced version of that. But for me, I really see it as, for me, when I first tried to take a look at the eighth sphere, I saw it a little bit differently, in the sense of every planet that we see is not just a planet. It is a chain of planets. So everything that exists because of a chain of functions and prior existences that created in this plane. So it's not even really correct to see the earth as the earth. We have to acknowledge that the earth also had a moon phase, the earth had a sun phase, the earth had a Saturn phase. And then at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that the earth is the earth, and it is a physical thing, and it is also just the earth. So we have to have this kind of like twofold vision to understand things. We just can't see things as a physical thing, or we can't just see things on one plane. That in itself is harmonic, it's a fragment. We have to be able to see things on the plane in which it exists and is most meaningful for us. But we also have to know the other planes in which it is created from. And when I looked at the eighth sphere, for whatever reason, I saw it as being connected with moon and then old Saturn's sun as like a black hole. So it really represents, for me at least, when I look at it, I see it as being the eighth sphere, but I also see it as the eight spheres having formed over a very long period of time by accumulating all of the prior phases of development, all of the things that we didn't heal, all of the backwards nature of all of the past stages of development. That is also part of the eighth sphere. It's hard for us to understand that because we can only see where we are now. But there's this sort of black hole, black sun aspect of it, a dark one, that's also a mechanism that I see as being part of it. But it is in a different dimension, which is why I think it's hard to clairvoyantly see or even mention. We're only usually seeing a piece of it. And then the reason why it's a big deal now, and the eighth sphere is being brought forward now, after being very, very hidden by mystery schools and considered very dangerous to reveal to people. The reason why it's coming forward now is because after the incarnation of Christ, we begin our spiritualization process, or our rise out of matter, right? We begin to rise. This is why Christ rose from the dead. He entered the earth for 3 days, and then rose from the dead. This symbolizes us as well, rising out of this plane, rising out of matter. It's our resurrection as well. So because that event has occurred, that has allowed Earth to rise and humanity to rise into a higher form, into a higher existence. And if that happens, there's also an opposing downward impulse. And the spirits of form, what are known as the spirits of form, are naturally always bearing down. They're very connected also to Ahriman, and they're sort of creating that eighth sphere over time. And then eventually it begins to really consolidate through the moon, but also using Earth. It's not the moon, it's not the Earth, it's something in between. And it begins to kind of condense as an artificial sphere that's made from basically all of humanity's pain, all of humanity's confusion, all of the stuff that they've been able to wrest away by being imbalanced. And that is what forms this sphere. And so that's really what it is. And it exists now because the spirits of form and Ahriman are pulling downward, but then the earth is also rising up. And so there's this incredible clash going on, right? And so in a sense, it's a natural process that the eighth sphere forms. And it's been forming over a long time before we even probably remember. So that's how I personally see the eighth sphere. It basically begins to take its shape as humanity begins to rise out of matter and begins to be pulled into New Jupiter, pulled into Venus, and pulled into Vulcan. That is kind of the upward motion, and the eighth sphere is like the downwards, descending, materializing thing that's going on when we should be coming together. We should be collecting ourselves and rising. So that's how I see that. It's unnatural in that it is created from everything that is unnatural in us and in the cosmos, but it's a natural formation for spheres to form at the end of cycles, and for moons to form and things like this. The planetary the whole planetary system it is created through mitosis, through fission. So this is a natural thing, but the eighth sphere is unnatural because humanity is not supposed to be descending further into matter. We're supposed to be rising up now, rising out of matter, coming together. We've been differentiated and fragmented enough. We're now coming together and rising, and that's what that Christ balancing energy does. It is that harmonizing that allows this. The Antichrist energy associated with Ahriman and even Lucifer is that downward pull when we should be rising, right? So that is the dynamic of the eighth sphere. Okay, next question. Sam R. What influence has Ahriman had on UFOs and alien visitation on Earth? Great question. So I think that Ahriman has a major influence on many of the beings that visit the Earth. And I think in particular, one of the things that has stood out to me when I've been working on these different lectures and I've been going into trance and I've been communing and working on this is that, you know, what I was shown is that we're actually very, very confused about what aliens are and what ETs are and what interdimensionals are. And we're looking at it actually in a completely Ahrimanic way. And we're thinking that these are actually just simply beings from other worlds. And in reality, these beings are actually much more connected to us than we think. And so just the way that we view ETs is Ahrimanic because we think that there's something that is other. We think they are different from us. When in reality, there's a whole system of contact that occurs. And it's more correct to see them as kind of representing a different aspect of ourselves in some cases. And then there's also other aspects of what we think are ETs and interdimensionals that are actually created through genetic modification. They're actually not really alien at all. And my feeling is that they're actually created during the Atlantean epoch through massive genetic manipulation. And when Atlantis fell, there was a bunch of different forms that went into the cosmos. They went into the solar system to survive the cataclysms. And so for me, I cannot dismiss that I've seen that. And so now I'm also seeing, which I did not see before, now I'm also seeing that there has been a false cosmos that was constructed during the Atlantean period, where the Belial group, according to Casey's work, or according to Blavatsky, you would call them the Lords of the Dark Face. But the dark group, the Dark Brotherhood in Atlantis, thought they were gods. And they began trying to create life and live as gods and do all of this genetic engineering and all of this kind of stuff. They had incredible technologies that we don't have now. And it was a completely techno brotherhood, a completely brotherhood that was obsessed with technology. And so that never stopped. It just went off world. And so now I'm trying to discern, okay, well, what aspect of interdimensionals and aliens is actually from the Atlantean period? Because I think I cannot rule that out. And I think that this actually could be what's going on. I'm still working on this. And then I think that also there is a magical, the other kinds of contacts could be more of a magical nature, more of an interdimensional nature. And we're kind of conflating all this stuff. But because you asked about how Ahriman is affecting the whole UFO movement and aliens, I think it's completely, in a lot of ways, many ways, controlling it. Because I think that literally some of the beings that we think are alien or interdimensional are from Atlantis through genetic hybridization. And then because the cataclysms were happening, they had the technology to go off world. Now, there's also forces that are just very, very powerful angelic forces that are just very, very advanced humans that have nothing to do with that Atlantean Belial faction that tried to get off the earth and created this breakaway society that's been interacting with the world. And people think they're aliens and stuff like that, but it's really this dark Atlantean originating brotherhood. There's also beings that we interact with that we call aliens that are really more like angels. And this is where we get some of the Venusian stuff and Pleiadian stuff that they're not really saying they're from that star system. Not really. They're saying their level of initiation in the cosmos. This is what I've been shown. And so these are just advanced humans. They're just like you and I, but they're exalted in their nature. They have more gifts. They have more powers, or they're masters. And so they don't use technology. You know, a spiritual master or an angel doesn't need to arrive in a ship. They don't need to use technology to beam a message in your head. And I will tell you that there are certain aliens that try to convince people that they're having a spiritual experience, but it's technology that is completely armonic. They're trying to tell humanity that they created them, that they're responsible for all progress in this world. I talk about it in Mars Mysteries. So there is this massive harmonic impulse, and a lot of it has to do with technology, and a lot of it has to do with an aspect of humanity that existed in Atlantis that became obsessed with technology, the Belial forces, the Belial group in the Casey readings. And I believe that they still use that technology and try to convince people that it's a spiritual experience. It's kind of like how in some of the documentaries on like Gaia or, you know, like Ancient Aliens, when like they'll just have like a picture of a UFO and they'll just play spiritual music underneath or behind it as though, look, we have this advanced technology. Look, we have this UFO. And they'll just play like religious music behind it as though that's some great achievement. It's like this group believes the harmonic consciousness, or this harmonic group, they believe that if they can create a technology that they're gods. Because in Atlantis, that's how it was. In Atlantis, we were still mastering our form. You know, we discover in the Casey readings that people were still manifesting themselves between the Lemurian and the Atlantean epoch with animal parts on them and stuff like that. Like we had not mastered how to create form yet. And so if you could create a really amazing technology, a really incredible form as an Atlantean, it meant you were advanced, right? Now in the post-Atlantean epoch, that doesn't hold the same weight. We're almost too materialistic now. We're too materialized. It doesn't matter what you have or what you build. What matters in this epoch is what is inside of you and your ability to work upon yourself. And the technology goes inside of you. So basically, whatever you can do with a technology, eventually, when you reach a higher stage of consciousness, you can do it all from within your being. These are the cities in the Indian culture, the powers. You don't need to take a spaceship. You literally bilocate. You can heal yourself. You don't need to get a chip in your brain. You can heal yourself. We have to earn this level of advancement, though. So there's a whole aspect of humanity and even beings that are connected with the Atlantean epoch, going into this epoch, maybe even a breakaway civilization, that are in this techno-religion, and they've been there since Atlantis when the harmonic impulse entered the earth, or is associated with first coming to the earth in a big way. And they've been possessed ever since. And they're still using this harmonic system to make people think that they're gods. And also, again, working with Lucifer in the New Age to channel all the different things or whatever. So this is something that I've been working on, and over, you know, because I'm so engrossed in this work, I do feel like I've been seeing so many different aspects about interdimensionals and aliens and these kinds of things. And it's actually really, really, really complicated because there's a lot going on and it's not all the same at all. But when we understand our history, we understand Atlantis, we will really begin to understand the interdimensional phenomenon, the alien phenomenon. I promise you that, because the one thing that divides the darker interdimensionals and the darker breakaway stuff going on is technology, because they've degraded themselves to such a degree over time that they no longer have spiritual power, and they have to use technology to imitate spiritual power, to make people think they're more powerful. Okay, this is the danger with disclosure, and how when disclosure comes forward with all these people that are suddenly going to give us this disclosure movement, is no, they're going to introduce a techno religion. They're going to introduce an Ahrimanic, part Luciferian as well, religion that involves technology and aliens and consciousness and the computer as a and the cosmos as a computer system. They're going to make it inhuman and weird and technology based and military like. That's what is coming down the pipe. But it really began in Belial, it began in Atlantis, and it is rising again. It is rising again in a different way. Okay, so maybe this is another lecture. So what time is it? 2. I'm going to do a few more questions. Okay, we're going pretty deep today. Let me know in the comment section too what out of that interests you as well. Okay. Okay. Marcelo Seppi, what about the tendency of establishing hierarchies, of looking at each other with feelings of superiority and inferiority? How is that connected with Ahriman and Lucifer? Well, I mean, Ahriman is obsessed with form. And so it's the Ahrimanic impulse that wants to just make people all about whatever race they are or whatever their form has materialized. And it's also the Ahrimanic essence that wants to preserve everything just as it is. So I would say, I think that, I actually think that establishing hierarchies isn't necessarily a bad thing. Hierarchies are bad and negative when the people at the top of the hierarchy don't serve humanity. So we actually want to be in healthy hierarchies where individuals who have great powers and great abilities and can really be in service to mankind are at the top, you know? And so when you have really good leadership, they will sacrifice themselves for the betterment of mankind. That's a healthy hierarchy. Okay, what we are seeing with hierarchies is sick. You know, the political system is broken, it's sick. But that's because the people at the top are sick. So it's not the hierarchy itself. It's not the fact that hierarchies exist. We're always going to have leaders. We're always going to have people who are incredibly talented, who have a lot to give to the world. It's just how it's how we are interacting with each other. It's that we're not doing it properly, if that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to do one more question and then I will leave you to the rest of your Labor Day Monday. Okay. Okay. Paul Collins, can you speak a little about the rise in narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, lack of empathy, and Ahrimanic and or Luciferic possession? Interesting. Well, I think that you can see Ahriman and Lucifer in, I think, narcissism, especially the rise in narcissism. In one really interesting lecture, Steiner says that Ahriman is alive in the typewriter and in the cinema. And so I think that today we could probably say that if he were with us today, and I do believe he is here with us now, I think he would say that Ahriman is within our phones and within our computers and within how we interact with them. And there's sort of this distance that is created, I think, with technology, where we think we can like be someone else. We can lie about ourselves. We can kind of get away with a lot of narcissistic qualities and kind of quite honestly psychopathic tendencies, because we're not really having to reveal our true self. And I think that in nature is very Ahrimanic, because Ahriman is the spirit of lies, and he kind of creates that separation of us and our spirit. And so I can definitely see that going on with technology, the lying that always happens, you know, even lying in how our real appearance is. And then I think the Lucifer quality is also present in the self-interest and the self-involvement, in vanity, and in really becoming very self-involved without any thought of what you're contributing, having it kind of be all about you. That is very Luciferian, because remember that Lucifer is redeemed by selflessness in mankind, through taking your gifts, through taking everything about your life and giving it to mankind without thinking, what can I get from this? How many likes can I have? How much money can I make? How popular can I become? I want this. That is the Christ essence. The Christ essence is the force within us that says that's not necessary. There is something much higher that I am connecting to. And by serving God, by serving your own heart, by expressing your heart, you get into a completely different rhythm of life. You go an octave higher, and you start interacting with people, with money, with your work in a just totally different way, the way that we've always been designed to interact with, which is a way where we are giving. And again, this is not the giving of ourselves in an unconscious way, but knowing ourselves so deeply that when we give, it has great power, right? And so that is what redeems Lucifer. And that is also, I think, what we're missing in society, because we're becoming very inverted, and everything is about what can I get, or what about me? And we are moving into a very normalized condition of, I think, of narcissism in some respects. Certainly not everybody, but I think that Ahriman and Lucifer have a big impact on us and on society today. So we know how to redeem them. We know what they are. We now know who Lucifer is and what his traits are, how they work within us. We know who Ahriman is now. We know where he's coming from. We know what he represents. You know, if we see something that seems to be Ahrimanic now, we can stop and we can say, you know what? This is feeling pretty Ahrimanic, and we can stop. And we can allow that Christ principle to enter us. We can bring it forward. We can radiate it from within. It's already there. It's all within us. And we can look at it and say, I don't think that's balanced. And we can raise it up. We can look at the Luciferian impulses within us and in the world, and we can say, you know what? I think this is a Luciferian impulse manifesting within myself or in the world. I'm just going to leave that be. And then you can bring that Christ essence forward within you, and you can ground it. We lift the Ahrimanic essences back to spirit, which is balancing for them. And we ground the Luciferic essences in the heart. And we ground them in general. which is balancing for them. So through us, through you, through me, through our work, which is true spiritual work, we transform these beings, we transform the planet, we transform ourselves. That's why they enter us. That's why they can enter us, as we are meant to transform them through our Christ essence. So I will leave you here and I will do some super chats. Forgot all about that. I'm so used to actually, I'm so used to doing this on my private platform. And I actually go live every second Sunday, and I go live for about 3 hours, and I basically just take your questions. And it's whatever you want to know. It can be kind of personal, emotional things and whatever struggles are going on, or we can just take the training wheels off and go deep into the esoteric stuff too. We do politics, we do everything. And so I'm sort of used to I'm sort of used to doing that. But I'm going to do more live streams and stuff like that for sure. So here are some super chats. Oh, thank you guys so much for supporting my work. It is because of your grace that I'm able to be here and do this. So thank you so much. So thank you, Karen Carpenter, Andy Leon, North Wind. Thank you, Kelly Mershan. Thank you, Sundari Bliss. Thank you, Suki Suki, Rizzy Fizz, Gypsy Spirit, Divine Esoteric Love, Simone Nyman, Stephen or Stefan, and Dario Dark Angelo. Ah, thank you so much. And thank you, Sam R. Thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate that. And seeing if there's anything else. I am going to be doing more lectures like this. My next lecture will be for my students on my website. That will then be posted on YouTube much later. And then I'll alternate between doing lectures here and on my private platform. Any work that's in this vein will not be private. I will always keep it public. You'll just get it a little bit later. But I do have a bunch of exclusive content on my website. If you'd like to be part of that community, I've got, I don't know, like hundreds of hours probably of Q&As covering a myriad of topics, from social issues to Steiner work to New Age stuff. It's all there. So if you like this, do consider supporting me over there. And also on my website, we have an amazing community of mystics. So if you're needing that support in your development, or you're wanting that sense of community, it is amazing. Yeah, I just feel very blessed to have all that going on. So shout out to Russ B. Yeah, so I'm just going to see if there's any shout outs here to do. I've so loved hanging out with you guys. I've so adored being here with you. I realized that I hadn't done a live on YouTube for a while, so it was definitely time. All right, so I was waiting for some shout outs to come in, but I think that's it. So, as always, all my love your way, and I will leave you to the rest of, oh, I see some shout outs here now. Kendrick Bullard, hello, Radagast the Bee, Joy Levin, Rionda Ruin, MJ Bodie. Shout out to Maeve Maiden, Sam 3, Aaron Robert Cattell, Scarlet Fire, hey, Crystal Fire, Joseph Tugas, Art Generica, Open Sky, Nicholas, Sangaris, Lois, Crafty Kim. Thank you so much for being here, you guys. Rubik's Cubics, Don Hare, Sam 3, Charles Williamson, CMYK Ready, Tasha MN, Ronald Markman, Mr. Lindsay McDonald. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I've had a blast with you. Do sign up for my newsletter as well so you can stay informed on when I'm going to be lecturing again. And I will see you in my next stream.